The tale begins with a man looking back on his past. After finishing school, he started working in a large city. Over the past 10 years, his daily commute was disrupted by a crowded train. His job demanded persistence, and as his responsibilities grew, he spent even more time at the office, including weekends he seldom had free, losing his passion for reading his beloved historical novel before bed. The main character realized his life felt dull, and he longed for the calm and lovely hometown he left behind. When he woke up, something felt off. His hands were tiny, and his body had shrunk. He peered out a window in a room he didn't recognize, seeing a completely unfamiliar world outside. A voice called out for someone named Van. It was Till, Van's maid, who rushed in, alarmed, warning him of danger beyond the room. Confused, he asked who she was, but Till didn't understand his confusion. He remarked that the view was stunning, and said he'd move closer because the garden was so lovely. Till, stunned and puzzled by his advanced vocabulary and perfect pronunciation, since he was only 2 years old, was even more shocked because Van, nearing 30, now inhabited a toddler's body. Once a stressed office worker living in a tiny city apartment, he now had this new body and a maid, neither of which belonged to him. He wondered if he'd been reborn or had died. Strangely, he retained memories from this new life. He confirmed with Till that she was his personal maid, and she agreed. He also knew his name was Van Pharaoh. As Till praised his cleverness, he listed his family, his father, Duke Alpa Pharaoh, and his older brothers, Mercia, Yard, and Sesto. But one thing eluded him. He had no idea where he was. In the dining room, the Pharaoh family sat down to eat. The father, Duke Jalpa Pharaoh, the family head, the eldest son, Mercia Pharaoh, the second son, Yard Guide, and the third son, Sesto. As they ate quietly, Van was surrounded by maids, charming them by eating his vegetables neatly. It reminded him of being a VIP at a hostess bar. He still held memories of his past life in Japan before waking up in this world, though it all felt unreal and confusing to him. He resolved to make the most of it. His brother Yard appeared anxious. Their father, Jalpa, asked Yard what he'd learned that day. At dinner, Jalpa always questioned his sons about their daily progress, a regular habit in their home. Van wondered if this was typical for noble families. They kept their distance from the children in the morning, stayed idle, and during the day, the boys studied sword skills and lessons suited to their ages. Next, Jalpa asked Sesto about his day. After hearing from him, he turned to Van, asking what he planned to do. Van thought carefully and replied that since he knew so little, he'd study the country's history and culture. The room fell silent, everyone, including Jalpa, too surprised to respond at first. Then Jalpa laughed heartily, proud of how bright his youngest son was, despite being spoiled by his mother, Marara. Jalpa believed Van had inherited his powerful fire magic, and Marara eagerly anticipated his coming-of-age ceremony at 8 years old. In this magic-filled world, knowing one's magical affinity and its purpose was crucial. Noble families prized the 4 basic elemental magics: fire, water, air, and earth, used to attack, defend the family and home, or heal. Those with rarer talents faced scorn. His father and brothers all wielded these 4 elemental magics. Van, however, thought any magic could be valuable depending on how it was applied. The Pharaoh family was a noble group known for their military strength and a big country focused on war. They took great pride in their fire magic, which was powerful in battles. This world had a society similar to the medieval and early modern times, but magic made life simpler. If gunpowder started spreading, it would cause big problems. The weapons used were typical ones like swords, spears, and bows, but magic was the key factor. This world had 3 continents and many islands, and Van was in a large nation in the southern part of the Gier continent in the west, called the Scuderia Kingdom. The royal family there had ruled for 300 years and was slowly growing its land. The current king too led nobles with combat skills to attack smaller nations and take their land. It looked like even Van's father had risen from count to duke because of this. Van asked Hill if there was just one port for ships, since sailing through deep seas could mean attacks by huge monsters. Though passing through a narrow strait was tough, it was safer. Hill explained that besides humans, there were races like elves, dwarves, and beast folk, but they kept to their own rural cultures, so seeing them was uncommon. The maids were quite shocked at how hard Van's questions were to follow. One asked if he wanted a nap, but he said he was asking because he was curious and checked if they were tired. They said they were okay. Van kept asking about magic tools, and Hill told him that certain stones, minerals, and crystals could hold magic power and be used to make tools based on magic ability. After learning this, Van planned to ask Hill his big question about prodigies later. A 49-year-old butler named Esparta arrived and asked Van how much he remembered. Van was only 2. but he already knew basic letters and numbers. Asparta had served Van's father for years and seemed skilled. Van hadn't talked to him before, which made him nervous and sweaty as he struggled to answer. Asparta asked again what Van recalled so far. Van said it was fine to ask since he couldn't write yet. Asparta tested him with "What's 2 plus 3?" and Van answered correctly. Then Asparta asked him to subtract 2 from 7, and Van got that right too. After a quiet moment, Asparta said he'd teach Van himself twice a week from then on. This felt like torture to Van, as the lessons were far beyond a 2-year-old's level, and there was too much to study. Asparta was amazed at how smart this 2-year-old was. Van could now read, write, and learn about things like the noble system, land unification, and rules. Still, Van wondered what a 2-year-old should even be doing. Over those 2 years, he learned constantly, holding a wooden stick to practice swordsmanship. It felt like playtime as he sparred with Till in the tatami room. When Till won, another maid was annoyed she'd beaten Van and suggested he punish her. The idea sounded fun, but Till got worried since such a thing was usually serious. Van just flicked her forehead. Though he'd only trained for half a year, he practiced sword techniques daily. By age 5, he could spar with older apprentices called young warriors, winning by simply striking first with a stick. He loved it and got really into it, blending skills from combat sports like judo and karate into his sword moves to beat his opponents. His rivals were kids though, so their attacks were simple and repetitive. They lacked the skill and experience to beat Van, unlike his brothers Yard and Sesto. Van also chatted with lower-class people who seemed to enjoy his company. Deputy Chief D wanted to examine Van's hands closely. He observed that Van's skin wasn't rough or peeling, his hands felt smooth, and his nails grew long. Van didn't grasp why D was inspecting them so carefully. He mentioned that despite training each night, his hands showed no signs of it. Van clarified he wasn't practicing at night since he was too occupied with studies. On free days, he trained and enjoyed wielding his sword. D learned Asparta had tripled Van's study load recently. Now Van saw why his lessons piled up so high. D grew thrilled, eager to teach Van swordsmanship himself. He urged Van to focus on sword skills, noting his natural gift, and offered to train him according to his physique. D beamed with pride, excited to shape Van into a top swordsman in the kingdom. Seeing D's earnest look, Van explained he loved both books and blades, aiming to excel in both. D couldn't sway him and agreed to his wish. Van asked for gentle guidance, but that was far from true. D pushed him to exhaustion, offering no breaks at all. Even when Van tried resting, D told him to squat while doing so. Van first thought D was cruel, but after that remark, he deemed him a foolish brute. Till arrived, commending Van for his daily efforts. Though tough since his rebirth, each day brought joy he'd never known in his past life, a fulfillment he'd missed before. Now he thrived in a grand noble family. He committed to savoring this delightful life fully. 3 years on, he'd long been dubbed a prodigy. Then, a man swung a sword at Van, threatening to end his charmed existence again. The story shifts to Van at 6 years old, 2 years earlier. He remembered a day spent outdoors vividly. He felt his home buzzed with all sorts of folks. Watching them never grew old. Van mused, 6 years here, yet nearly 30 on Earth, with those memories intact. In this life, he was reborn as a noble's 4th son, hailed as a genius. Daily lessons and sword training felt brutal, like a torment. Even 12-year-old child soldiers couldn't outmatch 6-year-old Van. He picked up skills like a grown-up, which stood out as oddly impressive. Till, his loyal maid, said he handled swords with such skill, like a born mastermind. She suggested he might rival his brothers and lead the family in governance. Here, the weak lost to the strong, the toughest should rule, but Van's path differed vastly this time. Wealth, rank, respect, and control went to the family head. Thus, with gifted siblings ahead, he saw murder attempts as common in noble circles decline quicker. Luckily, Van wasn't close to his brothers. He figured they'd kill him without a second thought. But simply, whether he aimed for leadership or not, shining too bright could get him killed. At this pace, a peaceful life seemed out of reach. Till suggested outdoor fun, prompting him to shift from prodigy to just a kid. He chose to act carefree, starting with a shopping trip, then visited Murray Company, a vast firm with outlets kingdom-wide. He told Till it reminded him of Costco's scale. Suddenly, a man approached, dragging a child with bound hands, shouting at him. The child wore tattered rags. Van puzzled over the scene. The man gripping the rope told onlookers it wasn't a performance. He claimed full rights over his child, saying the boy's debt forced him to sell him into slavery. In this world, slavery laws permitted only 2 kinds, those doomed to die and those punished for crimes. Yet, in the past, Poor families sold unfed children into slavery to cover living costs. The father explained he used his son to settle debts, turning him into a debt slave. Van realized why he couldn't look away or speak, despite the grim sight. Slavery was normal here. To him, it was a rotten system, though people barely blinked at it. A woman spotted Van and asked if he was the king's son, the famed prodigy. She introduced herself as Rosalie, thanking him for visiting, and confirmed he was the talked-about Van, welcoming him to May company. She offered to fetch anything he desired. Van asked how much the enslaved boy would cost. Rosalie guessed he was around 8 and asked the father about his magic. The father said it was theft. She priced him at 3 large silver coins max. The father snapped, insisting slaves fetch 5 silver coins or more in shops, arguing they lasted long and should cost more. Rosalie countered that shops bought for less than half the sale price. This boy warranted only 3 coins, as small-framed males were less useful compared to women, factoring in upkeep costs. As the father fumed, Van intervened, asking him to hold off and treat his son kindly if he was family. The father told Van to be quiet and mind his own business. Rosalie, annoyed, called the father foolish and said they didn't need to buy the boy. She questioned if he'd sell even if he'd lied to his son. The father claimed everyone tricked him and he wouldn't sell to her anyway, dragging his son off to another shop. The boy looked pained. Abruptly, Van halted them, offering 5 silver coins to buy him. He stayed composed, sensing the child might die if he didn't act. The father demanded the cash. Till said she had only gold coins. Rosalie told her to swap them inside, promising to handle it. Rosalie and Till paid the father while Van spoke to the boy, asking if he was okay and could stand. He introduced himself as Van and learned the boy's name was Cameron. Van said he was now free to go anywhere. Till wondered if Van bought him as a slave, but Van just wanted to save him. Till worried the father might retaliate, and Van thought leaving Cameron alone on the road would be risky. Plus, Cameron knew little, and Van couldn't abandon him. He asked Cameron if he had a place to go. Silent at first, Cameron then asked if he could join Van's home, suggesting he could help with tasks. Another boy warned Van that the king wouldn't let an unknown child into the mansion unless enslaved. Van asked Cameron if he agreed to that. Cameron nodded yes. Van suggested they check out clothes first, wanting them to look sharp together from now on. Rosalie noted they needed a slave contract first. She took Cameron's hand, and a mark formed on it. The slave contract sign, unique to slaves unless undone. As a contract magician, she waived the fee for Van's first visit. Van thanked her, surprising Rosalie. Unused to noble gratitude, she guided them onward with care. Rosalie first asked Van if he'd like to pick out clothes for Cameron, and Van grabbed his hand, asking him to join in shopping for some outfits. He felt a bit shocked by the request. They headed to a store where Van led him to a nice section. Van picked one side and didn't expect those clothes to feel strange, but Rosalie explained they were made of high-quality fabric, then pointed out another outfit typically worn by slaves. Van quickly said he didn't view him that way and felt the outfit he chose suited Cameron well. After that, Van mentioned he'd also get some underwear and shoes. Rosalie appreciated it and noted there were great shoes to go with the outfit. Van thought back to that day, realizing it was his first time out, when he bought a slave and assumed all would be okay now. Then Cameron approached Van, saying Deputy Commander D was searching for him. Van gave him a cookie and asked him to say he wasn't around. Cameron, suspecting the commander might already know, ate the cookie anyway. Van noticed Cameron wasn't wearing gloves. Cameron said they weren't needed. Van wondered if he minded people staring at his hands. Cameron replied it was a mark of their bond and should be visible. Van disagreed, saying it wasn't something to display like that, and bought gloves for him. Cameron put them on right away, promising Van he'd wear them since he provided them. Cameron returned to Deputy Commander D and said Van didn't seem to be there. The commander was shocked, noting witnesses had seen Van enter a room earlier. Cameron suggested it might just be an illusion from his deep attachment to Van. Then Deputy Commander D shouted, asking why Cameron still had food in his mouth. There wasn't any left. He accused Cameron of defying the deputy soldier commander's orders, calling it bold. Cameron said he belonged to Van as his slave. Deputy Commander D repeated himself, saying Cameron had grown brave and ordered him to take Van's place. He told Cameron the commander would train him and he should feel proud. Van, overhearing secretly, felt sorry for Cameron. Then he reflected that Cameron tended to be idle. He mused there must be some reward for dropping from a genius to an average kid. He decided if Cameron quit, he'd step in for him. As he watched Cameron and Deputy Commander D walk off, the next chapter shifted to people discussing Van's 8th birthday. It was time for his magic appraisal ceremony, and everyone was excited since he was a remarkable talent. The Pharaoh family's sons all had magic tied to the four elements, fire and wind, so they were sure Van would match fire magic too. Yet at the ceremony, Van had no elemental match. Instead, he had creation magic. Those with this power, also known as alchemy, were seen as the unluckiest magic users. It involved gathering materials like iron and copper, picturing items in your mind, and crafting swords or jewelry, which drained a lot of magic energy and limited what could be made. Using so much magic to create weapons and trinkets was something others with different magic could do too. Neither inventors nor blacksmiths needed magic skills for that. Van's life wasn't threatened by his brothers and the family power struggles. He'd spent 2 years lowering his status, and a low rank couldn't change his magic type. Nobles prized the four elements: fire, water, wind, and earth. In the Pharaoh family, those with strong fire or healing magic were especially valued. The oldest son, Mira, had wind magic, worked harder than anyone, and acted as the family head's deputy. Still, despite his wind magic, the second and third sons, who had fire magic, looked down on him. Among nobles, magic held great value. Jalpa, Van's father, couldn't believe he fathered a creation magic user, since both he and his wife possessed powerful fire magic. Van's mother, frail despite her strong magic, passed away after his birth, which fueled Jalpa's high hopes for him. Jalpa drew his sword and remarked that Van had shown odd skills from a young age, admitting he'd been foolish to expect much from him. As a result, he declared the Duke family wouldn't be held back. He wanted to keep this secret, insisting he'd have to kill Van to do so. Van froze, unsure how to react. But Mira, the eldest son, stepped in to shield Van, and when Yard asked what was happening, Mira explained he controlled a part of the Duke's land that was still untouched. This included a far-off village in that region. He proposed giving that area to Van. It was land Mira gained when he became a duke, and also where Count Ferdinand, whose own land had shrunk, sent knights for judgment. So handing the village to Van, even with a knight near Count Ferdinand, wouldn't cause issues. Plus, the recently gained land still felt some loyalty to the duke's family, and placing a family member there, even just for show, would help. Yard liked this plan. He decided Van would stay in that village as its lord. He told him to leave once ready, and after praising Mira for proving his value, departed. Right after, Mira knelt before Van and said sorry. He hated seeing his little brother struggle with creation magic. He'd always been poorly treated by their father and brothers for his wind magic. He wouldn't mind if Van resented him for suggesting such a tough idea. Van didn't hate him at all. Mira had saved him. Otherwise, Van faced death or capture. His tongue might have been cut out, and he'd likely end up a slave. In this dire moment, he vowed not to squander the opportunity Mira gave him. Mira was constantly amazed by Van's sharp mind and often wondered where he'd learned such impressive words. He believed Van thought things through more deeply than he did. From the start, Esparta and Till loved reporting Van's successes and progress. The Duke family chose to send Van to a remote spot, a task expected to be tough. Still, Van was ready to put in full effort. Mira said he was fine with it as long as it helped Van. They shook hands firmly, and Van thanked his brother. Back home, Till was furious, arguing that even without magic, Van was a smart, respected noble. She thought sending him to a distant village was ridiculous, yet being a feudal lord had its appeal. With a silence order in place, Van calmed her, valuing her support, and admitted he was eager for this new village life, surprising Till. Van saw that recalling the gap between normal life and noble rules meant he could now call himself free. Taking on feudal lord duties in a small village would probably give him lots of free time, making him wonder how to use it. Thinking of the hurt from being abandoned by his father and brothers, he decided to make the village his happy haven, a spot to live well and enjoy. In the next chapter, nobles spew grand words to boost their pride, but their real focus is self-preservation, not the kingdom, even if it means ignoring their people's safety. Simply put, nobles often scorn commoners, especially adventurers. This chapter shows a group debating their job to protect a noble's kid. Since they can't work with royalty, they had to take it. The largest of them asked why he agreed, and he said it was because he had no other option. Van arrived brightly, flashed a kind smile, and shared his name with them. Ordo, who appeared to lead the group, was stunned by Van's charm and returned the polite greeting. Van began complimenting Ordo, noticing his large, hefty weapon. The rest of the adventurer crew also showed curiosity and awe toward Van. After greeting them all, Van departed, leaving a warm impression. They found him quite likable, though he seemed like a typical sweet kid they'd be guarding. Yet Ordo cautioned them against ruffling his hair. At the same time, Van was with Cayman, getting ready for their journey. He instructed him to load his bags onto 3-horse carriages. He noted this escort couldn't use night army wagons, so Mira had hired adventurers instead. Initially, they planned to send just one carriage for him, but Mira insisted on more. Till was joining them too. She was committed to serving Van wherever he went, so she tagged along. Only a handful knew he had magic beyond the 4 main elements, but gossip couldn't be stopped. Dee also came along, vowing to strike down anyone blocking Van's path. Van asked if he could request a night army escort, but Dee wasn't sure either. He urged the group to speed up preparations. Asparta arrived and said it was a bit soon for Jalpa, but he'd retire shortly. His kids were all adults now, so he saw no issue joining Van in the countryside to unwind. Asparta had served with his father for years, making it tough to part with him or find another loyal aide like him. Still, Asparta would oversee Van's education during his retirement, which made him a bit anxious. Van saw everyone had packed heavily, as if not heading to a village, but he felt thankful for their support. Dee brought energy and Asparta offered vast wisdom. Till noticed Van's odd grin and asked if something was up. Van gave a regular smile and said he was simply happy they were all coming, thanking them. Till shared that many maids like her wanted to join, but only she got permission after begging Mira. She said Mira was often busy and rarely chatted with maids. Yard and Sesto treated them poorly, but Van stood out. He'd greet them daily, share snacks, and even pitch in when they cleaned. The maids training with swords also adored Van. Feeling shy, Van told Kamen he could stay in the kingdom if he didn't like it. The slave deal could be altered or ended, and Mira would agree if asked. Kamen said he'd chosen to serve Van for life. Van, flustered, playfully asked if he liked him that much, but Kamen earnestly said he both liked and admired him. It was time to leave. Van thought his father wanted him gone quietly, erasing his presence as much as possible. He'd spent 2 years in that town, but now it felt empty. As they prepared to go, a girl ran up and called to Van. He recognized her as a guard's daughter he'd met a few times. She asked if he was heading somewhere. He wondered where she'd heard that, then she pointed, and Van saw a man with horses behind them, which he found mortifying. The soldier said, per Dee's orders, they hate for Van to slip away like a fugitive. He added they at least wanted a proper farewell. The soldier mentioned Dee was napping in the carriage and would update him when awake. Then Dee woke up, shouting that Van, the kingdom's 4th prince, was present. He commanded the road be cleared for him and said he'd handle any officer asking for approval. People gathered, asking Van where he was off to, urging him to return soon, and wondering if he was studying in the royal capital. Van bid them farewell, surprised by how much they seemed to care. Meanwhile, Till grew teary and began sobbing. A man walked up to Van and announced that the beef barbecue was prepared. Van realized they'd need to travel through 2 cities, but first they stopped to camp for the initial time. He recalled living in a car in his past life, but this was his debut camping in a risky world teeming with monsters. For this trip, he'd hired 2 adventurer teams to guard him. The man with the beef barbecue ortho sheet appeared to be the leader, a skilled adventurer with over 20 years of experience, comfortable dealing with clients, even an 8-year-old like Van, whom he thought could communicate firmly. Van expressed gratitude for the beef and Ortho's care. Then he suggested Ortho take a break for a while. Till noticed that even adventurers could see Van's generosity. She imagined if Van were her master, they'd discuss 100 more wonderful topics. Van reflected that after leaving town and passing 2 cities, he camped multiple times. He considered what they'd encountered. They'd visited 4 additional cities, some large, some small, resting a full day at each. He noted their slow pace due to heavy luggage. Over 2 weeks, they traveled 50 to 100 kilometers daily, totaling 500 to 1,000 kilometers so far. The kingdom was huge. In Japan, it'd be like crossing 3 or 4 prefectures, though he wasn't sure of the exact distance. Till informed Van they'd reach the village soon. At last, Van thought it resembled a workplace getting a new manager. First impressions matter. As he pondered, the carriage halted upon entering the city, and Van asked what was happening. The man gripping the horse reins said the village was in trouble under attack. Van, the adventurers, came in and Till formed a circle, debating their next move, trying to form a strategy. One guessed it could be bandits or fleeing mercenaries. Another said anyone feeling scared or doubtful could step back, while another claimed he was ready for combat. The village had sturdy, thick wooden walls, making arrows nearly useless. Armored soldiers guarded the gate, with a group of magicians behind them. Villagers could only hide like turtles in a shell. Dee urged Van to let them fight, insisting teamwork could beat the enemy, as he put it. Van estimated the foes numbered around 40 to 50. He wondered if they should battle without knowing their enemy's nature. Ortho Sheik called it too risky. Dee admitted he knew that, and injuries or deaths were possible, but all could handle it. Ortho said he had his own rules. They didn't take jobs requiring team sacrifices. He told Dee that, as an adventurer, he must have faced such moments often. Ortho replied that risking everyone's lives would have killed them long ago. Dee asked the group if anyone was willing to gamble their life. He said the village was now his lord's first domain, along with its people. In a crisis, he couldn't resist drawing his sword. Ortho told Dee he was a fine knight, but that didn't involve them. He said even extra pay wouldn't matter if he died. He added he at least liked to guard Van. He said they might escort them depending on circumstances. Aspard rejected this, saying Dee would gladly die for others. He claimed Dee could take on over 30 foes, including mages, calling it and even fight. He said if Dee fell now, no one would lead the village, and they wouldn't fight even if he died first. Asparta noted he was still a 4-element mage. He said the open space would reveal their combat strength. Ortho was shocked he could fight. Asparta told everyone they didn't need to take chances. He'd start by raising a barrier wall. Adventurers would strike from behind it at a distance. When the enemies looked their way, that was his tactic. Repeated surprise attacks would boost their odds of victory. Ortho asked if magic attacks could be blocked, doubting anything but arrows could stop them. Van explained that one cart had iron reinforcements at key spots, making it safe to hop in and retreat after the first surprise strike. He said their sole aim was to throw the enemy off initially. He questioned if Asparta would stay back and face them. Asparta agreed, saying as the decoy, he'd keep hitting from behind the wall or Dee and the others would perish. Van disliked Asparta's words, feeling it spelled certain doom. Asparta finally argued that he, an elderly man, would be more helpful, asking Van to let him take the risk instead of Van playing bait. Everyone turned to Van, eager to hear his decision. Till stepped forward, blocking Van, and refused, telling him she wouldn't stand for it, and rejected the idea outright. She said if Van were the decoy, she'd rather confront the foes herself, confident that if they targeted her, victory was assured. Cameron chimed in, saying he'd join too. Van told them all to listen up again, asserting he was the leader there. He said he'd weigh that option, with Ortho and his team escorting him to the village, but that didn't mean fighting to save it. He told Asparta, retired from a noble household, that he'd done so much for Van's family and shouldn't die there. He said Dee and the night squad served his father, not him, and he'd owe his father an apology if they got hurt. He looked at Till, saying he saw her as an older sister who'd been with him more than anyone, and he couldn't bear losing someone so dear. Then he faced Cayman, saying he admired his truthfulness. Though Cayman was his slave, he didn't need to die for him. Van added he was happy Cayman enjoyed his life. He thought that for someone like him, labeled useless and cast out by a noble family, it was incredible and kind that people chose to follow him, so he couldn't let them die just by issuing orders while doing nothing. He'd never be that awful leader. As the one in charge, he had to lead from the front, and he genuinely apologized to them. Van began speaking, saying he'd take the cart and push forward first. He asked everyone to strike from both sides, but reminded them ranged attacks were key there. He said if the enemy didn't back off, they could flee and leave his body behind. He noted that even if bandits killed him, as long as his identity stayed hidden, the duchy wouldn't care. Now Ortho was fine with taking risks. Van called Ortho a kid, saying he'd claimed he'd risked his life for duty. Ortho warned Van that any more talk like that would force him to reprimand the whole group. Wool admitted she'd been tricked by nobles before and had only met ones who bragged, but Van recalled their names individually, which is why they'd risked their lives, she said, and all agreed. Meanwhile, Van thought he remembered Buell's name because she was cute. Dee said they were proud knights of the Pharaoh family serving Van, who'd shape Pharaoh's future. He vowed to guard Van there and secure Pharaoh's tomorrow. Asparta said once the exile was done, he hoped Van would recall his noble duties and obligations. He told Van it'd wrap up in 3 days, though Van thought that felt endless. He said he'd tweak the area and carry out his plan, first building a barrier and hitting from afar. Dee and his knights would charge from the left, Ortho and his crew from the right. Those not fighting would stay ready for emergencies. Dee shouted, "Got it," and they all began the plan. Once the wall was up, Dee with his knights and Ortho with his team were set to advance. Ortho thought that old Butler was more of a mage. He could fight decently as a 4-element mage, and wasn't just a servant. Still, he wondered if, in some cases, refusing the young master's order back then might have cost his life, Ortho said. Ortho agreed, saying he was too precious. No noble like him should die so young. Ortho said if he could, he'd want that boy to be a lord. He said these past 2 weeks had totally shifted his view of nobles. It seemed a family could have someone like that. He was very curious about Van, saying he'd rush to aid him if trouble arose. Though Ortho still knew little about Van, lord of a small village. Even so, it was a hassle and tempted Ortho to back out. He risked his life for duty despite being dragged to such a place, not just for the land and its people, but also the knights, retired butlers, maids, and slaves. After all, adventurers lived to craft plans like this, protecting everyone without losses. Yet an 8-year-old like Van would risk death just for himself. To Ortho, Van was truly an odd kid. When Van came back, Cameron and Till embraced him, praising God in relief. Cameron figured if Van were in danger, he'd shield him first, then follow him wherever he went. Van saw them as his true family, telling them they were in a fight and to act if they could help. He directed them to fetch medicines and first aid kits from the cart. Poole said they'd step in if things got risky, nothing more, and they shouted, "Roger," before charging back into battle. The bandits grew relaxed. Nearby villages and towns were crumbling, and their assault on this little village was nearly done. As the bandits plotted their next move post-attack, an arrow struck one from behind a wall. Ortho and Dee hit simultaneously, and Ortho was impressed by Dee's skill. Wielding a massive sword effortlessly showed why he was the Pharaoh family's deputy knight commander. The enemies panicked now. They tried fleeing, and Ortho pursued until he spotted one heading their way. He yelled to halt him, but the ranged team couldn't see past the wall. He shouted the enemy was nearing, though it was slightly too late. Poole faced the huge foe. She needed her magic, but it took 10 seconds to recharge, and she couldn't manage it. She thought death was certain, but Van and Cayman rushed to her rescue. She warned them this wasn't a foe kids could handle, yet they ignored her and struck. After relentless blows, the enemy fell. Van warned that other foes might strike there, telling them to guard the front while Poole wondered what was up with this kid. Eventually, some bandits fled, but the attack force was wiped out with no one hurt. They achieved the best outcome after that. Ortho said the job would be done if they got half the client fee. He cared about more than cash, asking if he could linger there a bit. The others declined since they had work in the next region. And this gig ended here, though they'd return later. Still, a few wanted to stay with him. Dense woods and peaks nearby meant he could hunt demons without quests for a while or even earn some coin. Poole noted Van didn't seem like a noble's son, not looking the part. That's why Ortho wanted to stick around. He was curious what a kid like him would grow into. Van's quick mind stood out, unusual even for a noble's education. At first he seemed like a noble child, but once he spoke that faded. He was courteous and kind, but often acted like a lively, warm kid. He never hinted at looking down on commoners despite his noble roots. Ortho confessed he'd never met a noble like him, and the crew nodded in agreement. They remembered Van saying before the fight that his magic wasn't fit for combat. In short, he'd been ready to give his life for them all back then, a choice unlike any noble's. Poole noted that Van had stepped in to save her when she was trapped. His actions didn't seem childish. They resembled the seasoned knights from countless fights. Yet this boy wasn't even 10 years old. He was an enigma, outshining any noble they'd met. Ortho was eager to see how the land would fare with Van as lord. He checked with his crew if they too wanted to witness it, and they all agreed. Till was pestering Van, insisting he let Cameron take the lead next time. Cameron was plotting ways to grow even tougher. Poole stepped up, saying sorry for cutting in. She teased that Van was already making girls weep at his age, but Van replied he aimed to be genuine with her, especially since she mattered to him. Poole wondered if he was an elf, as their kids don't age like they appear. She still wasn't sure how to address him, a noble who didn't act noble. Van said Till had raised him from infancy and figured he must be human. She then asked where he picked up sword skills, nodding at Dee, saying he'd been personally trained by him. Though not fully grown, he was taught to outmatch his own strength. She asked if his smarts and quick thinking came from Asparta, and Van said yes. Poole knelt, saying she owed her life to Van's bravery and sword prowess. She was deeply grateful and would always remember this favor. Van grinned and said it was no trouble. Poole thought it'd be an issue if it stemmed from noble charm, but here an adventurer had captured another adventurer's loyalty. Asparta told Van the villagers were assembling at the gate. It was his first encounter, so he aimed to leave a strong mark. In the next moment, villagers crowded together, and Van presented himself to all. He said he'd been dispatched by Lord Pharaoh, the recent ruler of this region, including their village. From now on, he'd govern this place. The village elder, Rhonda, approached and thanked him for saving their village and its people. Van brought up tales of local owners and troops who ignored orders. He said he intended to shield this village, so he'd take charge moving forward. He asked for their support and cooperation. Ortho found it overly stiff, but kept quiet. Rhonda welcomed him to his home as a gesture of goodwill. Inside, he shared that the village had 150 residents 6 months back. A month ago, bandits struck, dropping them to 100, and today marked the third raid. Van asked why they'd become a prime target. He suggested it might be due to the nearby Gen Kingdom border. The border guard knights patrolled it under Earl Ferdinand, but with a new lord, the border was neglected. Basically, the village suffered because it now fell under Lord Fellow. Van said the old ruler, Count Ferdinand, had allies in every town. It seemed his father, Lord Fellow, placed rulers only in big towns, leaving small villages' fates unclear and overlooked. A tiny village didn't need guarding and paid next to no taxes. Van promised to keep them updated from now on, saying griping, mourning, or faulting the kingdom was pointless. Even if they doubted it, nothing shifted. Ronda Galaga's son looked mad after Van's speech. Van told him to sit, speaking for the village while thinking its future was dim with such a hothead. Van noted that King Berlin, the kingdom's founder, might have left a legal gap. Quiet lingered after his words. Asparta cleared his throat to nudge him to speak. Van felt a bit nervous but remained committed to leading this village. He said whining about kingdom laws and their effects wouldn't alter anything, but this village had them. Van outlined 3 clear steps. First, they'd craft something valuable the kingdom couldn't overlook. Second, they'd earn cash and hire mercenaries often. Third, they'd restore and grow the village on their own. A woman there said they'd considered this too, but in such an isolated spot, none of it was simple. Selling wood or stone wouldn't turn a profit, and their lack of schooling made it tough to create crafts of different worth, so they'd struggle to make money. Van acknowledged their hardships, but said he was here now, educated, and would do all he could to protect and improve the village. The response wasn't what he hoped, so Asparta cut in. He explained Van, at just 8, was given land to manage, and many saw him as a talented kid for it. Dee chimed in, saying as knight leader, he'd come to serve them loyally and wished to join their group. Now the villagers looked moved and impressed by their words. They asked if Van had the 4 elements, but he halted them, saying he lacked those, so they shouldn't count on fighting skills from him. Their top priority was strengthening the walls to keep intruders out. The fence was sturdy but wooden and weak to fire. Asparta said stone would hold firm with active magic, though it later turned to mere dirt. Van told him to use stones to bolster the walls. He was confident they could build a strong barrier soon. A moat could help too, keeping bandits at bay. Dee offered to take on this task. He urged others to set traps and ready attacks from the wall. They'd need bows, arrows, or stones, simpler for villagers to handle. Van stepped out and shared his plan with everyone. He vowed to work hard for the village's growth. He said though he was young, he had support, and if foes came, they'd resist. By his speech's end, he felt like a politician. A man had a question. He asked about taxes, noting they paid 30% on crops and monster hides and teeth. Van lowered it to 10%, offering to cover any shortfall himself. The villagers were stunned by his proposal. He said a steady life mattered most. Some had sold kids to settle debts. Others feared bandits returning soon and wanted knights. But he said a message would take 2 weeks, too late for aid. They wouldn't come anyway due to the distance. The villagers were mad at being left behind. Van got their frustration but said the Marquis currently lacked funds for knights to guard a huge area. Even if knights were convinced, they'd be too few to matter. They'd need 200 men. He asked Asparta to raise a stone wall behind the wooden fence, and he did it without hesitation. The villagers were astonished. He said they needed their help now more than ever. And if they pitched in, the village would survive. Housing was short, so they slept in a wagon. Ronda offered his home, but they couldn't displace him yet. Van never griped about only having production magic, but the sting of their letdown over his lack of battle strength lingered. He tried to win them over, but they remained doubtful. He had to gain their faith for the village's success and a joyful life. He swore to himself he'd safeguard the village and make it a great place to live. In the next chapter, Van, Asparta, and Ronda were talking. Van said if the enemy didn't strike, they could hit first, likely from the walls with magic bows and arrows. Asparta replied that from a short wall, the attack wouldn't do much. Ronda said they once used spears to strike back through openings in the forest fortress. Dee replied that the enemies were now in a similar spot, making it possible to jab them with spears once more. Van mentioned the term catapult. Ronda wasn't sure what it meant, but Asparta clarified it's a weapon for sieges, not suited for their defense. Dee told Ronda it hurls giant rocks, though their landing is unpredictable and reloading takes a while. Still, it could smash fortress walls and lookout towers since they're large targets. Throwing a crate of small stones would extend the range, and aiming at the gate would boost their strike's impact. Van also proposed adding oil bottles and a torch to ignite the ground, making their attack even fiercer. Asparta, intrigued, asked who invented this device, and it turned out to be Van, though they doubted his production magic. Van didn't fully grasp it himself either. Traveling to the countryside, he practiced shaping stones, wood, and metal freely, and now he'd demonstrate his skills. In the next moment, Van asked Ortho if he thought they could take over the village since the rival group had fled. Ortho agreed and said he'd stay a while to earn extra cash hunting legendary beasts. He paused, sensing monsters nearby. He warned Van it might be risky, suggesting he rest by the trees close by. Van marveled at Ortho's knack for spotting and crushing hidden foes as he roamed. Yet despite his talent, he couldn't level up. Kin spotted a massive tree, but Van said it was too large to chop down. He pointed to another, but that was oversized too. Van tested his ability. He couldn't picture the form sharply, so using magic made it odd and weak. Production magic wasn't simple to wield. Focusing on a tiny piece, he thought he could shape it as he wished. A warm feeling grew in his gut, flowing to his fingertips. The image needed to be small and precise. He had to envision even the tree's fibers, and if he did, they'd weave together, forming a tight bond. He knew he'd done it when the fibers broke apart and fused. They turned into a wooden cue. It was wood but looked like plastic. The fiber block was remarkably tough. It outdid treated wood in strength, so they planned to craft plenty from these blocks. They'd refine them later after heading to the coach. Cole approached first, asking if he'd gathered wood. It was lighter and tougher than Ortho expected, resisting breaks. Van urged him to test its durability by breaking it. Ortho struck the block over and over, but not a single split appeared. Van pondered which was sturdier, rock or this wood. He was just thrilled to find something so practical. At the carriage, he realized his magic energy was drained. Till asked if that mattered, he'd heard magic was tricky but followed rules. Seeing his creations, Till admired their fine craftsmanship. Van was still decoding how magic functioned. He needed to picture a whole weapon, its metal, sharp edges, and form. He made a sword and handed it to Kamen, who was so awed he swore it'd be a family treasure. He also forged an axe for Till. Noticing her expression, he wondered if she disliked the weapon. He felt down since he'd labored to make the axe strong and unscratchable. Till assured him she adored axes, even cuddling it. Van seemed persuaded and happy she liked it, but deep down, he knew she didn't and vowed to craft her jewelry next time. Van pondered if using more magic might boost his power. He then thought of a unique way to apply it. In the next moment, Ortho praised Esparta's magic skills, saying he was a fine mage alongside Van, which flattered Van a bit, feeling equal to Esparta. Bull found Esparta odd, noting such mages usually joined armies or became top adventurers. Van was simply thankful Esparta stayed with him despite nearing retirement. He cared about Esparta's future as much as his past, hoping he'd enjoy his later years. As he thought fondly of him, Esparta came over and told Van he was maturing, and as a lord, he'd need to bear the title's duties. Van got nervous, quickly saying their focus should be on bolstering village defenses, promising to strengthen the gates. As Esparta pulled him along, he paused and asked how Van planned to do it. Dee stepped up, offering to stack stones, grumbling that everyone here seemed clueless. Van clarified he'd use magic for it. Dee realized his error and said he respected Van. They tried telling Van his efforts wouldn't work with magic alone. The gate was wooden, so he'd shape it like his usual wooden blocks. His main worry was its weight. Weight was crucial for blocking enemies. That was their current limit. Next, they'd craft a hefty metal gate. Van focused and made a huge gate, stunning everyone. He told Ortho to slash it with his sword, claiming it'd fix itself, wanting to test its strength. Ortho swung with full force. It was a solid strike, but it only left a small mark. Van felt wood wasn't right, though others quickly disagreed. The next morning, he woke up irritated, cramped from sleeping in a tight space with just a sleeping bag. He couldn't even clean up properly yet. On the journey, they'd slept in camps and wagons. Even in the village, the carriage was their bed. Outside, Till and Enon met him. He was okay, but Till and the rest were worn out. They were too tired, and this couldn't continue. Before defending the village, they needed food, clothes, and shelter. He chose to try building a house. He asked Kamen to grab the wooden blocks. Rhonda approached, asking what was happening. Van said he wanted to construct a house there and checked if it was safe and fitting. Rhonda replied it was the village center, perfect for Van's mansion. Van also considered a festival when they had spare time. He felt capable but unsure if he could build beyond a basic house at first. He made 4 support beams, then set the size. He imagined it like wire laid on the ground. Thicker posts were ideal. Then he needed floors and walls before adding the roof. He visualized it, but it felt much larger now. Interior walls were next. He used all the blocks, finishing the house. It had a kitchen, toilet, 1 large bedroom, a smaller one, and 2 extra small rooms. He had to use those or Esparta would be upset. He added window shutters, He'd need to ask traders about quartz sand. The house was complete and quite spacious. Asparta didn't see it as big. He thought it was a tad small, yet it was the grandest home there. It didn't even look wooden. Everyone marveled at Van's ability. His magic was fascinating, but he still believed strong combat magic outshone it, thinking villagers should see their lord as a solid shield. Till argued she preferred Van's city over Jalpa's domain. Asparta agreed that in war, combat mattered, but in peace, people craved a leader who improved their lives, and he couldn't imagine anyone better than Van for that. The group arrived, and Dee, especially, was stunned. He couldn't fathom Van crafting a house with magic so fast. Van said with more wood, he could build homes for all. Dee told his crew to grab food, using wagons if needed. Van had never seen such quick work before. Even Ortho was excited about the house and offered to chop wood. He urged everyone not to let the knights outdo them. Van was puzzled since Ortho lived rurally and didn't need such a place. Soon, Rhonda brought villagers, sharing that Van could build houses. People began telling Van about their housing woes. As he'd feared, it wouldn't stop at one house. He wished he hadn't told Dee, but their rundown homes were obvious. He finally agreed, telling them to line up for new homes. If his magic could cheer them up, he had to do it. Espa and villagers worked on barricades. He, Mr. Orr, and others cut timber. Van took Till and Cammon to construct houses. He'd gotten used to his power of managing such builds well. He also wanted to design his own interiors. It felt like following someone else's commands, which saddened him, recalling corporate slavery days. But once started, he couldn't quit. Dee remained awed by Van's vast magic reserves. Building such an impressive mansion took real know-how. The homes formed 4 clusters. Streets and alleys followed a grid layout. This style was known as a block. Common folks' houses were made alike, keeping things fair. It sufficed for now, but with building stone, he'd tailor each home later. Though already thankful, villagers bowed and offered goods when they saw him. He also built a small, basic bathhouse near the mansion. He made it for himself, but was pleased others enjoyed it. Pool purified the water with her magic and heated it with an old-school fire method. Pool and Till invited Van to bathe with them, but he got flustered and shy. They saw him as an 8-year-old, but he was mentally in his 20s. He bathed alone, then went to his bare room. Sleeping bags inside felt dreary, so he quickly made beds for all. He crafted simple bedding from local hay and straw. Sleeping in a cozy bed made him content. After a solid rest, he woke to a tasty breakfast with Till. Eating in his own home and laughing freely with kind Till felt wonderful. But Asada told Van they needed steady income. Right now, merchants brought goods monthly, their only outside link. Asada was stern, despite omelette on his mustache. Van didn't want to discuss this over breakfast and felt irked at Asada. He said he could handle houses, furniture, clothes, and home needs. They had enough supplies. He aimed to boost defenses, but Asada noted they lacked spices. He added they didn't have stuff for Van's favorite sweets. That angered Van. He decided to make something to sell now and asked for suggestions. Campson proposed Van's wooden blocks, but it was dismissed since only Van could make them. Till suggested hunting monsters for materials, but Van nixed it. Otto and crew already hunted, keeping their haul, not the village's. Asada said selling crops was the fix, but this village's quirks made it tough and slow for quick cash. They needed the best option. Zara was convinced Van was smitten. He'd already told them to test it, see how it goes. He handled trap removal, but said they feared ruining Van's special talent. Zara assured them it'd be fine. Noticing Campson and Till's anxious looks, Zara presented an oak piece, leather-lined inside and along the edges, making it tough and durable. He asked Cammon to strike it, and when the blow was feeble, he nearly urged him to hit harder. But then the oak snapped in two like thin paper. Everyone was shocked. Zara teared up, upset that his fresh oak was ruined. His surprise grew when he found out it was just a wooden weapon. Van told him to hold it, promising to make it stronger than before. He actually did so. Orto arrived and asked what they were up to. Spotting Van, he wondered if they could sell it. He said the deep woods held many strong evil spirits, likely due to the Wolf's Mountains. He added they could extract rare minerals without climbing the peaks, iron ore, plus silver, copper, some gold, and even mithril ore. Van was excited by this find. They were fortunate to discover these in the forest. Ordo had an idea. So far, mining had been tough due to the remote location and rough land. It seemed only night trips had been tried here, with little focus on herbs or minerals. Van said it was a perfect shot for skilled adventurers to start mining, and if the foothills had rich deposits, the Wolfsburg Mountains surely held more. First, he reworked the iron ore. With wood, recycling spread evenly across layers, But with iron ore, magic seeped into some parts slowly and others fast. They turned the quick-to-recycle bits into sand. A third of the original size stayed to test its quality. It needed melting and refining since he wasn't sure of the ore's initial purity. Zara eagerly asked Van if he'd forge a sword from it. Even a slim, double-edged one would do. Ordo wondered if he really loved swords that much or just iron weapons overall. Van said since Zara brought the ore, he'd craft weapons for all the adventurers. Thrilled by this news, Zara requested a dagger and a long sword. Van focused and began shaping the first iron weapon. The blade was thicker than a katana's, but its edge had to be razor sharp. He thought metal density mattered too. All that remained was assembling and securing it. In seconds, he held the finished sword. It was quick, not from cutting corners, but proof his skills had grown. He gave it to Zara, who shouted in joy. As they crowded to see the new sword, Van aimed to make it longer with the same style, ignoring the chatter. He succeeded, crafting a sharp, strong sword, and handed it to Zara. Seeing Zara's gear, other adventurers clamored for Van to make them weapons too. Poole said it was tough to judge without testing, but they could fetch a high price. Espada called it a rare find. Ore deposits in a forest, not mountains, were unusual. Iron sand was more common. The ore in these rocks seemed very scarce. They expected stone, iron, or other ore golems, so nearby dungeons might explain it. Ordo's crew had never found such a thing. Zara pondered if they could be remnants of golems wrecked long ago. Orto inquired if any dungeons were nearby, but no one knew yet. They hadn't scouted the area, so one might exist somewhere. Espat said finding a dungeon would transform their trade, bringing heaps of business to the village. Van grinned slightly, pleased at the thought of the village gaining value from a dungeon he might uncover. Dungeons were packed with valuable stuff. Most of the nation's weapons, gems, and relics came from them. That made them vital. Adventurers' Guild rules required members to report new dungeons to the guild. When a guild got such a report, it could set up a branch in the closest town. Spotting a new dungeon was a huge win for an adventurer. It was a solid way to build a reputation. You might even join the top adventurer ranks. You could also earn the first shot at exploring it. Van noted that right now, if the village reported a dungeon, they likely couldn't handle guild members' costs. Espat agreed, saying adventurers, traders, and knights would swarm the place. Food and supplies were already scarce. There was also a risk of attack from a nearby country. Ferdinand might strike. Ordo asked if they should hunt for the dungeon, but that'd get them kicked out. Poole said once word of a dungeon spread, knights would rush in, and Van's magic could fix building issues fast. Van said he was a thorn in the Fertile family's side. If they got the chance, they'd eliminate him, so they needed to grow the village first before staking a dungeon claim. Then the Fertile family couldn't touch them. Ordo told the group to check the area where a dungeon might be, circling it while gathering resources. Claiming it now wouldn't pay off, but Van hoped for a future reward. Dungeons mattered to the kingdom and nobles alike. His family saw him as worthless, with no role in their plans. Claiming a dungeon could flip that script. For now, it'd just go to one of his brothers. That's why he had to use his skills to keep this village his own. Strolling with Till, Van said housing was set for the moment, and next up was funding and defense. Till asked if his magic still held up, and Van admitted he was wearing out. When he's exhausted, he can't do much. They needed workers, but few locals had crafting skills. He wanted a stash of weapons and shields ready before traders showed up. Defense was just as crucial. The outer wall was nearly done. He placed stones and made the walls as tough as concrete. At first, they lacked height and bulk, but he fixed that. On the wall, he added a basic ballista, made with leather parts. It had a large shield up front, letting them shoot big bolts safely against enemy fire. He set towers around the village edge, fitting them with ballistas too. Till went to fetch dinner, and after she left, Van thanked Kamson. But he sensed something wrong and asked about it. Kamson said he'd only brought stones, yet Van reshaped the village so smoothly. He seemed to still be grasping Van's abilities. Van said as Lord, it was his job to benefit the village. He asked if Kamson had any dreams. Kamson aimed to guard Van. Van appreciated his loyalty, but gently asked him not to push too hard. Van recognized Kamson's honesty and deep loyalty toward him. He resolved to craft armor for him next time. His cherished knight deserved top-notch gear to stay safe in tough spots. Over 3 days, he labored intensely, turning the village into a mini stronghold. Van thought it was ideal, but he wondered where else you'd find such a secure village. Espada didn't even see it as a village anymore. It was more like a compact fortress. Now, bandits had no chance of sneaking past those walls. He pondered what might happen if Jalpa saw Master Van's strength. Espada countered that the family head valued combat skills above all. There was no use debating it now, but Dee insisted it wasn't unthinkable to use Van's talents in a fight, and with time, he'd outshine everyone. Their disagreement heated up, so Van stepped in, saying it was pointless to dwell on regrets or the gifts he was born with. What mattered was adjusting and thriving with what fate handed you. He tossed out some sayings he picked up, and they seemed to enjoy them. Dee chuckled and nodded at Van's words. With the mood lightening, it was time to get busy. The ditches were freshly dug but still dry. A ditch was great for protection. It even had a nice look to it. He didn't think they should overlook drinking water. The ditch's base and sides needed strengthening. They had to set up a water supply path. Currently, they fetched water from the river or strained collected rainwater. As he mulled over a steadier water source, a sound came from behind. Bandits had arrived. They were approaching from the opposite side. Van ordered the bridge lifted and gate shut. He asked if anyone was still outside and sent someone to look. Just days in, they followed his commands readily, though fighting still spooked them. It was like the last skirmish. He felt a bit of fear too. As Lord, he couldn't show it. He admitted their worries, saying some might get hurt. Yet this fight was key for the village's future, so he'd stand up for it. He said he couldn't do it solo and sought their aid. Van's uplifting speech hit home, and they no longer seemed scared. Van began issuing commands, but before heading out, Till clutched him. Seeing her teary eyes, he told Dee to take his crew and scout the enemy's moves. Dee, brimming with assurance, said Van could count on him, calling him a brilliant leader and genius, the best, even if odds were against him or he was cornered. Dee was sure Van would triumph. He took pride in outdoing Commander Stradal, and now he'd serve Van. He trusted him and was ready to lay down his life. Dee checked the scene, and his man reported it was now clear what groups were out there, likely bandits. He saw them coming their way and told Van. He added they were a few hundred yards off. They needed to prep for defense. Van asked if anyone trailed them, which could happen. As they weighed options, someone spotted a tail. Armored dragons were charging toward them. Things looked grim. Even skilled knights struggled against armored dragons, and this village lacked seasoned fighters. It seemed the dragons were driving the bandits right at them, and normal weapons couldn't pierce their armor. His magic worked, but only Espada and the adventurer's daughter were mages fit to fight now. The adventurers had chased after supplies on their own. Without a mage, a sturdy knight might delay a dragon and strike its weak spots, but the villagers couldn't manage that. They'd crumble under tail and claw strikes. Van commanded everyone to man the ballistas and keep bolts close by. Dee also urged them to heed Van's directions. Villagers fled from the dragons, yelling for aid. The onslaught seemed endless, tough to fend off even in a large town. Dee estimated about 40 armored dragons, each 8 meters long, and suggested using the bandits as lures, but Van pitied them and asked for another option. This amused Dee, who said sorry. He believed laughing at danger eased the tension. In a pinch like this, a fix would come up. He told them to target the dragons, firing when bandits hit the moat. Van asked if the bandits could reach him from there, and they said hitting eyes or mouths would work, improving their odds. Dee boldly claimed no one would die today and they'd win this fight. Dragon barbecue for dinner tonight, he boasted. Next, bandits raced toward the village, terrified of the pursuing dragons. When they got near, Dee readied his crew. Though he hid it, he knew how dire things were. He ordered the catapult team to launch. Arrows flew but seemed to vanish against the dragons, doing nothing. Yet Van's crafted arrows actually punctured their hides. One hit a dragon's paw, broke it, and pinned it down. They didn't kill many, but it was a shock. When Van asked Dee what happened, Dee said he'd done something incredible, though Van didn't quite get it. Dee explained they took down 10 dragons in one shot. He added they'd run out of arrows and needed more from spare ballistas. Van suggested wooden ones if iron was gone. Dee relayed the order and prepped his men. After one round, confidence surged, assuring victory. The next shots would be sharper. Watchtower crews had settled into place. Dee had no doubt they'd triumph. He called for arrows to flaunt the village's might. Dragon roars of pain echoed everywhere. Wooden arrows broke through, less effective than iron, but still piercing thick scales. Dee told them to keep using wooden arrows, aim, and shoot. After several rounds, all dragons fell, victory secured. Taking out 40 dragons with just 60 arrows was beyond what Commander Stradal could fathom. Dee beamed with pride for Van. He approached Van, who looked thrilled. It was Van's first dragon sighting, and he was stunned, calling them dinosaurs. Dee laughed, clueless about that term. Dee's joy burst out, pulling Van around in victory glee. Van saw people outside the gate, and Dee said 30 survived. Dee ordered them bound, warning them to obey or else. The bandits, terrified, even offered to be slaves. They pleaded for jobs. Rhonda said these folks had often raided their village. Villagers, furious, attacked them for past family losses. Just as one swung, Van grabbed his fist, not wanting him to stoop to their level. He said they'd face justice, so no need to mirror their wrongs. Turning to the bandits, he said punishment awaited. When help arrived, they'd be hauled off. Until then, he tasked them with gutting dragons for magic cores. Ortho couldn't believe how incredible the past week had been, certain those memories would stick with him forever. And Zoro was equally amazed by the weapon's quality, even though only 30 people could use Van's flawless swords. They could handle 4 or 5 bodies daily at most, so timing was key. Ortho chose to start cutting them up while they were still fresh, beginning the next day. Dora's team, Kamen's team, and the Free People took care of the remains, and Van had improved the cleaning knife's material, making it much sharper. The group wrapped up in 3 days, and that night, Van gave a speech thanking the villagers and everyone for their hard work. Now the village had no money worries and could enjoy any spices he prepared. He threw a feast for all, warning them to limit drinks to 2 glasses. Van savored the dragon meat, crisp outside, yet juicy and tender inside, sliding across his tongue. Ortho noted how the fatty, delicious meat was shielded by a tough shell, explaining why dragons were so costly and worth selling. Ordo ensured the ballista arrows matched the weapon's strength, but Dee overheard and felt crushed that he didn't get a sword, while the adventurers loved theirs. Dee and his crew swarmed Van, begging for swords and daggers, and though Van was flooded with thanks and food offers, he stayed humble. The villagers thought him odd for sticking to his ways despite a tough path ahead. It was Dee who'd nearly attacked bandits for killing his family, but he thanked Van for holding him back. He vowed to improve the village for those lost. Rhonda and his assistant Aldo enjoyed the feast, and a woman was glad they could unite, even with aristocrats present. Asada warned she shouldn't think like an aristocrat, but that was Van's appeal. Till gazed at Van, sensing he'd do even greater things soon. Later, Ortho, Van, and others discussed selling the dragons. Ortho said a shelled dragon would fetch 20 gold coins from merchants, but with most meat spoiled, they couldn't sell it. Factoring in transport for the rest, they'd get about 8 coins per body. With 30 bodies, they'd earn over 300 coins. Van mentally converted it to yen, over 300 million. Espat praised his defense efforts, and Van thanked him for the protective barrier. Asada noted that despite the success, a law demanded villages earning over 100 gold coins pay 50% tax to the Marquis' treasury, revealing the village's wealth. Espat explained that hiding it would be tough but doable, leaving Van stunned. He'd never met someone so loyal to the Marquis for decades like Espada, yet here he was, suggesting a trick to fool his father. This wasn't like the dungeon. Now they'd secretly buried the truth, betraying his father. Still, he wanted peace without his son involved, so Van asked for his plan. Espat said he'd report it to his older brother Mera, giving him credit for the dragons. And knighthood wouldn't work, so he'd say Hessen, and the adventurers found a herd in the forest, claiming they'd wiped it out. Van's 3 older brothers were all fighting to be the family head, each tossing him aside while trying to win favor, but Van wanted Mercia, his loyal supporter, to come out on top. He decided Espada's plan was brilliant and announced it. The next morning, the villagers greeted Van with praise, and he grabbed Till's hand. She was startled at first but glad he sought her affection. Though Van acted mature while bathing, he was still just 8 and leaned on his childish rights. Eventually, he let go of her hand to keep his pride, though the thought of Till leaving him someday upset him. Still, he chose to focus on her joy instead. Van started to mention something about Till's future partner, but she cut him off, saying she wanted to stay and care for him, never considering anyone else. At the gate, Van asked the guards if they'd seen anything odd. It was merchants, Mr. Bell and Lango. Van could barely see their dark shapes, but the guard recognized their faces. To be safe, Van ordered the bridge raised and ballastas readied, despite their protests. The merchants insisted they weren't bandits, but Van worried bandits could hide in or around the wagon, endangering the village. He refused to take chances and sent kin to fetch Ortho. They had much to do, and it hinged on Ortho's efficiency. The moment Van had awaited finally arrived. Meanwhile, the merchants were stuck. Their wagon had broken down, ruining many goods. The man inside told the driver to tally repair costs, lodging, and convoy fees. Even after reaching Hashimura, they barely profited. The bald merchant asked the speaker if this was Hashimura, noting it didn't look like a village. He wondered if they'd lost their way, but there was no mistake. As they debated, Van greeted them from the gate, introducing himself as Vanni Furto, the village owner. He demanded that if they were traders, they list their company and names, or if escorts, their roles and names. Hearing his name, the merchants grew uneasy. The two hesitated, but the bald one said their base was the biggest city, where they'd seen Van's name often. It was definitely him. The driver was stunned by Van's youth, knowing geniuses were often outcasts, but not to the point of being sent to the border by the Marquis himself. They introduced themselves: Mary Bell, a merchant, his brother Lango, also a merchant, and a security guard, an adventurer named Eyre. Van asked Ordo if he recognized them. Ordo confirmed they'd met at the Adventurers Guild and shared drinks. Van allowed them into the village and welcomed them warmly. Rhonda and others greeted Bell and Lango, who apologized for their long absence and shared their relief at everyone's well-being. Van approached, apologized for the delay, and reintroduced himself. He quickly asked if they'd buy dragon shell parts. Both brothers lit up. Adventurers dreaded facing such tough creatures, so this was a rare treat. Nearly crying with joy, they followed Van to the warehouse. When they arrived and saw 23 meters of armored dragon materials stacked up, Bell and Lango's jaws dropped in awe. Van told them they defeated around 40 shelled dragons and captured about 30 people, then considered using those captives to help transport goods. He added that their wagon had been fixed. Processing all this, Bell said they'd need to call traders as soon as possible and asked Van if they could wait a month to sort it out. Van agreed, saying there was no rush since it was time to enjoy some tasty meat. Bell realized the village couldn't eat all that meat before it spoiled and asked if Van minded them selling it to a nearby village, offering to cover the cost. Van wondered if that village could pay for such meat. Bell explained it was a poor place, likely broke after taxes this year, and their own food was probably low. He suggested giving some meat for free to help out. Van liked the idea and said they'd donate it. Though Bell was a merchant, Van saw profit wasn't his top priority, impressing Bell with his sharp mind. Bell offered to pay well for the bandits too, even if their profit would be slim. It was still income. Van thanked him, inviting him back with a promise of a great deal, like top-notch armor. Bell was shocked again and asked if he could bring a blacksmith, plus a skilled draftsman and carpenter. Van flashed a charming smile, showing off the armor he'd made, leaving them stunned. Bell didn't fully grasp the weapon's pros and cons, but as a display, it was stunning. Ordo handed him dragon skin to test, which he sliced through easily. The guard Eyre was excited and wanted to buy some. Bell marveled at Van's incredible offers, but admitted they couldn't take too much. Van said it was fine. They could buy more later. As they toured the village, Van pointed out his new projects, then served them delicious dragon meat. Bell asked if merchants visited monthly and suggested doubling it to twice with the trade group's help. Van said they needed supplies and sake. One good meal cheered the villagers up. He also requested ads for their weapons, suspecting the brothers wanted an exclusive deal, which he liked. He said if two traders stuck to this route and sold weapons together, they'd soon reach his village. Van proposed they create ads. The more they sold, the more they'd earn, piquing the brothers' interest. He suggested a village shop, saying if they could talk to the enterprise owner or any traders, it'd be perfect. Bell and Lango beamed at the thought of steady income and their own store, then even considered building them a house if they agreed, since a shop would save him from dealing with multiple merchants. It'd be the village's first, a win for both sides. Bell told Lango to pitch it to their boss before leaving, assuring Van they'd work in a store here until things improved. They shook hands, sealing a successful deal. Van also requested that a letter be sent to his brother Mercia, detailing all his successes. Near the village gate, he constructed a shop for Bell, sweating and nearly crying with joy, explaining it had a store on the ground floor, living quarters upstairs, and a basement for storage. He followed Bell's directions as closely as he could. Bell trusted Van's skills, but hadn't expected such immense power at his fingertips. The goods needed to be ready in 2 weeks, wrapping up deals with Bell's shop for now. Later that day, they left the village for the river. After some walking, Till asked if Van was worn out but urged everyone to press on. Cameron led the way, clearing their path. Truthfully, Van aimed to show his kindness and concern for all, but he struggled to keep up his energy since Cameron was so robust. The trip from the village took an hour, revealing a long, scenic river where they'd fetch water. With that, they began building the water system. Espa, using his magic, dug dozens of meters in moments. When he rested, Dee, Kin, and others dug manually. Van trailed them, reinforcing the walls. Espa's magic strength was astonishing. Dee worked tirelessly too, despite nearing 40. Till remarked how tough their task was, given the river village distance, but water was vital for survival. The work was grueling, but he felt teamwork toward a goal was rewarding. Beyond the barrier, there was a joy in shared effort. Better living conditions would improve life and attract merchants and visitors. That was his vision for an easy life here. After 8 hours, the village came into view. It was meant to take a week, but their speed was incredible. Van called a halt for the day. Espa and Dee were shocked, as a few more hours would finish it. Van pointed at Abulu and Cayman, urging Dee to notice them. Dee thought it was good training but agreed with Van. The hidden might of the older crew and veterans was intimidating. The next day, they reached the village by mid-morning, surprising everyone, and prepared to channel the water. Van praised their amazing work. They opened the flow, and water rushed in with calm beauty. Kids and villagers cheered as water hit the village. Rhonda was pleased with the time and effort saved, but they still needed to filter and boil it for drinking. Lou arrived, curious about the tool Van planned to craft. Van offered to build it with him, and Lou jumped at the chance. The filter used branches, leaves, sand, soil, stones, and cloth, placed at the canal's end near the village. Clean water would flow into a metal container. A tap beneath the tank would release water to a boiler, heated by a fire magic crystal. Lou went to ask Belle if he stocked those crystals. Ken reported the space was full of water. Van was happy with the outcome. He worried about floods. Rain had raised the water level. Espa was impressed. Van noticed, explained they'd widened the channel based on water volume and built banks where flooding was common, though it took clever planning. The water had nowhere to escape. Van needed to ensure excess could return to the river or form a lake behind the village. Espa liked returning it to the river but said a lake would be great during dry spells when river water slowed. A reservoir was invaluable. Van asked if flood protections would suffice, and Espa assured him a lake 200 meters behind the village was the answer. They rushed to finish this critical task before the rains hit in 3 days. The lake was nearly complete, and Van wanted to add a spillway or similar feature, though he needed to figure out its practical use. For now, he was just a cheerful kid thrilled to have so much water. In the next moment, Van felt anxious and irritable. He woke before dawn, finding Rhonda and many others in a frenzy. Dee and Espa had already gone to Lake Van, a name Van didn't know the origin of. Till said the lake was named in his honor to mark his efforts for future memory, and the village was now Van Village. Van had a bad vibe about it. Something felt off to him. Before they could talk it over, a villager burst in, panicked, urging him to come. Van and Till raced to the lake. It seemed they took a back route to get there. At the village, a worried crowd had gathered. Van asked what was happening, and they pointed to something in the lake. It looked like a figure staring back from the water. In the dense forest by the river lived a legendary creature with striking blue hair. They were half human, half mermaid, known as Abalu. Van hadn't heard of them, so Espa said they were rare to spot, identifying the girl as Avalo. Van asked her name, but she didn't reply. She seemed confused. Van told Till and Kin to fetch meat and fruit. He figured food was the first step to connect, in his view. The girl edged closer, and everyone tensed up. After sniffing the food, she asked if she could have it. Van was so startled he spooked her, and she darted off. He said sorry and coaxed her back with the meat and fruit, which she ate. Tasting the dragon meat, she scowled and asked who hunted it. Dee, Ortho, and the rest credited Van, though it was the ballista's work. Hearing this, she swam off and vanished, leaving them stunned. The next day, Till stormed into Van's room, yelling his name. She said villagers reported an attack, sparking chaos. The word attack jolted him awake. As he dressed, Till said the enemy had seized the water channel. Van hadn't thought they'd get so near, but he was sure the ballistas would scare them off. His sleep cut short, he was cranky. Outside, he saw many Abalos staring at him. Yesterday it was a child, but now there were adults of all ages, though they looked youthful. The oldest wanted to speak with Van. Nervous, Van called Dee, Ortho, and Espa to join him. Belle was there too, saying the Abalo brought rare items and traders claimed dealing with them was big, suggesting it was a smart move. Curious for a better look, Van let him tag along. They approached, and the man said his daughter thanked Van. He'd heard this boy beat a dragon, and it seemed true. The other Agalus looked amazed. They wondered if he was a mighty mage. They also noticed the tough folks near him. The man praised him as a bold human. He declared he'd approved a marriage between Van and Ulpriora. After a quiet pause, Van voiced his shock, while those behind him stood frozen. His mind raced with questions. What was this guy saying who was Ulpriora, and what was this marriage talk? The man, Ulvesta, Ulpriora's father, asked if Van rejected it. Van asked where she was. She was off playing with friends. Van asked how long he'd been planning this marriage, noting she was just a kid. Ulvesta explained their race was unique and hadn't dealt with humans before, but dragons had recently taken their river, killing their kin, so they sought a strong mate for Ulpriora to protect them. Van realized they wanted strength for safety, like nobles using marriage for alliances. Van insisted she should wed someone she loved. Van declared strongly that they'd guard the Algalu without any marriage. Vesta then said they'd stay with their son-in-law and asked if Van owned this water. Van clarified he didn't own it and suggested they shift to the lake, where bridges existed, as guests or traders might get spooked. Then he caught that Vesta called him son-in-law. He attempted to clarify he hadn't agreed to wed, but they were already moving, and Priora dubbed him her husband. Espa remarked Van was fortunate to bond with the Abdallah, joking that Van's first wife was a Balu. Till was fine with it if Van chose it, but even if he refused, the husband's protest flopped. The Abdas relished lake time, while Van pondered if he should oversee them as lake owner. To follow through, he built 2 shelter-like structures with roofs and walls for resting. They could hang out securely. Van was glad they enjoyed it. Espa didn't know such buildings were called Scaria. Van's broad knowledge, unknown even to Espa, amazed him. Villagers began chatting with Abgalu, sharing grain dishes. Soon, talk spread that the lad brought ores. Their bond grew stronger, so Van opted to erect another wall, sturdier than before, large enough to enclose the lake and bolster village safety for the Abalo. Espa suggested adding features for a decimal city to plan ahead. Van asked if it'd be huge, housing 10,000 people. Just aiming for village growth wasn't enough. A wall meant guards to man it, so Espa advised building for a big population on a smaller plot. Van wondered if a setup for 1,000 or 2,000 might work better, but Espa disagreed. He said it'd take more time later, a key factor to weigh first, and it wouldn't happen soon. Espa's stubborn streak shone through. When he spoke up, even father couldn't argue back. Espa went on, saying each section should stretch at least 600 meters, holding defenses, homes, and guild bases. Wall construction would kick off later with enough folks. For now, they could shape a wall to expand later. Espa noted Van sought a non-square fortified city design. He explained mages often broke through single weak points, but a square city was simplest to defend, like a star-shaped one. Its triangular sections, even if breached, wouldn't link to city roads and could detach from the wall's edge. No need to rush and hit corners before the core. Even if foes skipped them to smash walls, they'd face triple-sided assaults. This layout, worn on Earth with firearms, suited this sword and magic realm. Espa added that a frontal attack focused force, but corner strikes couldn't fan out side to side. That's why more people were key. It was a solid setup, he claimed. Even skilled mages couldn't shield infantry in it. Mid-talk, someone burst in, saying a messenger from Count Ferdinand had come. The message bore not just Ferdinand's emblem, but also Viscount Cayenne's unicorn and shield, a growing noble in Ferdinand's circle who owned this city. Van figured he might want it back. At the gate stood a girl and a woman, unimpressed by tales of this so-called kid genius. Next, 2 women chatted in a carriage. One calmed the other, saying not to fret and suggesting they find the right person to approach first. Van was getting ready for his visitors while Till fixed up some tea and snacks. As he fretted over how many might show up, he felt anxious but hoped for a good outcome. A knock came at his door, and he welcomed his guests inside. 2 women stepped in, one older, the other young. He greeted them, saying he'd been given charge of this land. The older one, Panamera Carrera Cayenne, had just risen to Viscount from a knightly background. The younger was Erit Ferdinand, Count Ferdinand's youngest daughter. She explained they'd heard Marset Pharaoh lived here, and her father wanted her to meet him. Van was caught off guard that they'd sent the youngest with Panamera as her guard. Though a bit uneasy, he expressed his thanks for their effort to visit his simple village. Rising from Knight Baron to Viscount in one generation wasn't common. She was clearly sharp and strong. Panamera noted how steady he seemed, despite being younger than Arut, with no hidden agenda. She asked what he thought their visit was about. Van sensed she was testing his guesswork. A count with shrunken lands might feel bitter yet impressed by the markets. The Earl feared Marset might strike, so he sent Panamera and Arut. Van suggested they were here to scout the rival's situation and negotiate with him. Panamera laughed hard, amazed a 10-year-old grasped it all. She agreed with his theory, adding that Mr. Ferdinand couldn't figure out Marset Pharaoh. His name had popped up often lately as a key heir everyone sought. A big event was nearing, with the Marcus bragging of ongoing success, but since it hadn't started, they came. She struggled to see why he'd been picked for this fief. Maybe because he lacked 4-element magic. Rumors called him a prodigy, and fief owners typically needed top learning to grow their land. That's why Graf puzzled over his placement near Count and Jinnit Kingdom borders. It wasn't overreaching ambition. Nobles killing each other was banned here. Van wondered what kind of woman spoke so bluntly. He confessed he had no 4-element magic skills, but her other worries were baseless. They dumped him here on a whim. Panamera found that hard to buy. She asked if tales of him being a crew were true. She'd heard this was just a 100-house village, yet in a month or two, he'd raised fortress walls, upgraded buildings, and used unseen materials. Plus, he had a skilled butler and a master knight. She figured he had at least 5,000 people. Tech to hide army moves worried them, yet he did it knowing he'd be noticed, turning the border into a military hub, she said. Van chuckled, which only fired her up more. He said sorry for laughing and aimed to clear up her misconceptions. He told her all his father let him bring was kinin and some gear. His family didn't even wave goodbye, just told him to slip out quietly. She pressed him about the night, butler, and folks outside. Before Van could answer, Deke cut in, saying they were drawn by his smarts and gifts, so they tagged along. He added he'd gotten a nightly order to return, but brushed it off. Espa joined in, saying he was old, and when he saw Van leaving, he figured it was a fine time to retire and pass his know-how to him. Till added that, noble or not, Van treated them fairly, and she was glad to work for a warm master who valued his team. Van felt thankful for his loyal followers who joined him in this distant place, and Panamera insisted on understanding how the village had evolved. He opted to demonstrate rather than explain, and though she was baffled, he casually mentioned wanting to construct an extra fortress wall outside. As they stepped out, the villagers awaited Van, who called for wooden blocks and began heading beyond the fortress. Panamera asked where they were bound, and he met her gaze steadily, sensing her worry of a possible trap, yet he kept quiet. A guide took them to a spot, saying it was suitable though the edges were a bit off. Van proposed a 2-meter wide wall, to be adjusted later, and build a fortress before her, showcasing his talent as a formation mage. He noted with a sigh that the wall would collapse once its magic faded, crafted from bones, volcanic and earth rocks, plus some ore, a hefty mix of resources. He'd hoped to make solid concrete but lacked supplies, so he used a short-term solution. Panamera, amazed, asked if those materials also built houses, and he nodded while forging a metal gate, saying he had to envision its form and sturdiness. Completing the wall and gate, he stunned everyone, prompting the princess and Panamera to question his magic, which he described as production magic, only good for making things and worthless in society. Princess Arut's busy father had no time for her, and her indifferent mother left her with a caretaker, deeming her useless due to her shy, picky nature and poor study skills. She lacked any real talent except puppetry magic, clumsy at physical tasks like dancing but adept at moving dolls better than herself. Though otherwise incapable, this skill let her finally cheer her mother. Thrilled for rare parental praise, she practiced, but her mother only shouted she was a useless child, leaving Arut confused about her fault. She later discovered high society scorned her magic, dashing her final hope, and her mother ceased visits while others ignored her. She lived silently, holding her breath, blaming herself as her mother's yells lingered. At 10, her father summoned her with Panamera there, who challenged why he'd send Arut, suggesting someone else. He hushed her nonsense as he spoke to Arut, who wondered about her. Panamera asked Arut if she knew of a future marriage, bringing tears to her eyes. Panamera said skill might spark marriage talks, but none would cancel them. Arut asked if her uselessness meant leaving home. Panamera explained her siblings were all wed, leaving her, and a good match would suffice. She grasped Arut's hand warmly, making Arut feel cared for at last. Their 3-week journey gave Arut her first joy. Panamera was kind despite her frequent anger, scolding Arut's uselessness, but then hugging her, often starting chats with a head pat. When Arut wept, Panamera stayed calm, patting her again. Arut adored her touch and playful jests. She wanted no marriage, just Panamera's side, so she planned a blank stare for this boy. Van's uniqueness irked her. He clicked with Panamera instantly, had respected servants and allies, and though younger, achieved much. She assumed his parents valued his gifts, but their indifference shocked her. Hearing him and seeing his useless magic feats turned her jealousy to fascination. Aristocrats prized 4-element magic, so she'd abandoned hers when her mother dismissed it. But now she pondered practicing again. Panamera realized he could fortify a key spot, eyeing the Graf's land. Van said his father, who'd expelled him for production magic, was clueless about it. Panamera called it foolish. His skill could have expanded their realm, but Van hadn't expected this either. He offered to keep building the wall, letting her stay longer, and she agreed, free of plans. Strolling the village, Panamera quizzed him how he made houses, if he alone had production magic, what materials he used. She got it partly, not fully. Van felt their confusion was resolved. Panamera raised marrying Arut to him, and he wondered if that's why she came. He noted the area swarmed with magic beasts, and they'd keep strengthening the village, but marriage wasn't required for peace. Curious, Panamera said he was directly tending Arut. When Sir Ferdinand broached her marriage, she'd opposed it, fearing a match with the possibly hostile mayor's family's youngest, a frontier lord's child. She doubted Arut's joy, and Van agreed, warning of death by bandits or monsters. That's why Panamera came, to spare Arut a forced marriage. Her grimness from dreading another abandonment, Van empathized, sharing her plight. Unexpectedly, Panamera softened, weighing Arut's happiness, and would accept a proposal if Van wed her. Though young, his wisdom and care for his people were beyond his years. Panamera noted that Van's mage abilities were beyond what anyone could imagine, confessing she'd marry him if they were peers, her praise coming from such a lovely woman. Van beamed inside at her admiration, masking his feelings while secretly thrilled. She asked Arut if she felt the same, assuring her she wouldn't force a choice. Arut was uncertain about Van, who admitted he hadn't considered marriage either, suggesting she could stay in the village without wedding him if she couldn't return home, a weighty matter needing careful thought. Panamera argued marriage would benefit him, as his quick village growth would spread word, drawing interest, and his unique power might attract rival nations, urging him to fortify his defenses inland. Van asked if marrying Arut would aid him. She replied it could bring future aid from Graf Ferdinand and her own backing, possibly preventing an attack from Graf Ferdinand's Kayan order seeking to reclaim territory. He mused that a political marriage thrived with few foes and many allies, better with economic perks, but Graf gained nothing by offering Arut unless his father had secretly sent him here. Otherwise, there was no profit or reason for ties. Panamera said they'd spend the night, giving him a day to ponder and discuss with her or Arut if curious. Van, shocked they'd stay, reacted like a typical 10-year-old amusing her. He asked if soldiers would join, and she claimed enemy lands were risky for a frail woman like her, needing their guards, though Van doubted her, knowing her immense strength. She asked Arut what to do, proposing Van's house, but Arut was too shy to reply. Panamera apologized to Van, noting Arut's youth, and asked if she could share her room, wondering about space. Van promptly decided to build a hostel, leading them outside to construct one for Panamera, Arut, and the soldiers, making a 4-person room. Expecting tents, they were delighted, inviting them to dinner and a rest until leaving. Till last, if flaky wolf meat suited the meal, Ortho's team hunted mystic beasts, and since the armored dragon, more creatures flocked here. When scaly wolves last appeared in groups, Van's crew swiftly felled them, yielding ample tasty meat. Till pledged to cook it well for Van's potential union with Arut. Van asked if Till was okay with it. She said it pained her after their time together, but she trusted Arut would bolster him, and she'd gladly serve him fully. If his wife was kind, she'd stay near. Hansen suggested he pick someone stronger like Panamera if he could. Assad agreed Panamera spoke truth. Graf gained nothing from Van wedding Arut, likely sending her because she lacked 4 elemental magics, while their kingdom, Scaria, had expanded its reach for 5 years. Nearby nations already feared them. That's why their king avoided fights among allies. Espa outlined 2 options. Expanding through war would drain their wealth, or Van could strip rights or disrupt them instead. Van insisted that, married or not, what mattered most was Arut's decision. If she couldn't return home, she could stay in the village without marriage pressure. If she wanted to leave, he'd allow it. They hadn't spoken yet, so he planned to chat with her at dinner. Later at the meal, Van kicked things off by asking if she enjoyed the food. He mentioned they could make sweets once they had more supplies. Arut was shocked he addressed her. She said the meat and fruit salad were delicious, pleasing Till. Arut was adjusting, though she'd rarely spoken much before and stumbled over words. Yet Van didn't judge her. Even someone as flawless as Panamera saw his rare qualities. She couldn't believe she'd met someone like him. Van asked about her interests. She loved cute things with bold certainty. When he asked if she liked small animals, she listed dolls, pretty flowers, and still creatures. Van, unfamiliar with dolls, asked if she'd show him sometime. His calm, direct manner felt mature, despite being younger than her. He listened patiently as she spoke slowly. She said her dolls were in the carriage and offered to show him tomorrow. Van beamed and thanked her, delighted. She felt a happy flutter and odd thrill. Too timid to meet his gaze, she let Van keep talking. She grew comfortable and wanted to start speaking up too. All through dinner, she longed to look at him and ask something, but her nerve failed her and the meal ended. Panamera praised the village's safety and calm vibe. She also said the food was so good she wondered where he got all the spices and supplies. The locals knew and respected him too. Van agreed Till's cooking was great, and the people were glad food was plentiful. Panamera said if she were him, she'd boast more about the village's success to spread word of his deeds. The walls and homes came from materials the locals provided, and he just worked with it. He'd have real pride when the village topped 1,000 residents. Their talk with Van wrapped up, but he saw Arut looked like she had something to say. 5 minutes later, he asked her. She bowed, thanking him for the day. She'd been nervous, thinking he was someone she had to marry, but his kindness eased her fears. She wished him good night. Van felt puzzled but glad he'd left a good mark. Arut knew she'd rushed her words and left before he could reply. Arut felt anxious that others might see her as strange and rude. She struggled to locate her room until a woman guided her there. Upon entering, she found Panamera in her pajamas who welcomed her warmly. Panamera wondered if the children crossed a line just because they clicked well and told Arut she could share any ideas she had. Arut's cheeks turned bright red, resembling a tomato, so Panamera eased off on joking and offered her a few more days of stay if she liked. Arut decided to extend her visit. Panamera pointed out they couldn't host them indefinitely and suggested Arut pay some gold coins for their lodging. All Arut could focus on was her plan to speak with him the next day, believing he'd hear her out. For the first time in ages, she fell asleep eager for morning. The following day, Van was telling the villagers that Asada would oversee the fortress wall construction. It wasn't a new task, so he hoped it would go smoothly. The project was big, so he urged them to manage their time and stay safe. He and his crew appreciated those supplying materials. Then he spotted Ordo observing and asked about his intentions, but Ordo said he was just curious and wouldn't interfere. He recalled how the villagers had once stood in formation like troops, ready to hunt mystical creatures again. With new swords, it was a breeze. Van noted they'd earn more if the animal materials were poor, but good ones could go to Bell. Since it was Friday, he declared a barbecue for today and tomorrow using their meat stock. This sparked excitement among the quiet villagers, turning them festive. Panamera, present too, thought his talk was engaging. They were an army, but it lifted spirits. Van emphasized that freedom was his gift to them. Then he saw Arut, who said hello and remarked on the nice weather, prompting Van to note her newfound energy. He asked if yesterday's trip had worn her out. Inside, Arut felt nervous but aimed to speak calmly. She wanted to understand Van's perspective and see his work up close. Later, they tackled sewage issues while Panamera and Arut watched. The pipes ran deep beneath every structure, needing regular cleaning and flushing with moat water. Without this, filth would build up, risking illness. The waste drained into underground chambers and back to the river. Suddenly, Abalo people showed up, offering help. Panamera and Arut were startled and puzzled. The Abalos said they lived nearby, and Van fed them. Prayola appeared, introducing herself as Van's wife. Panamera and Arut awaited his response. He clarified it was a mix-up, even telling her father they weren't engaged. Prayola, upset, called him a jerk and left. Others nearly scolded Van, but he distracted them with news of tasty fruit, and they dropped it. He explained they needed help lifting slabs from the water, which the Abalo handled instantly. They vowed to manage it daily. Panamera was amazed Van could direct the Abalo. He said it stemmed from various reasons, but they'd settled there. Next up was the ongoing castle wall project. Panamera found the area remarkable. Van complimented Asada for his speed. He told him the surface was smooth, but the angles beyond that posed some challenges. He chose to sketch a hexagonal outline on the ground. He instructed Asada to construct the wall this way, and Asada accepted. Asada quickly embraced the unusual directions. If the person marking the guides was unskilled, the project would fail. He'd studied trigonometry, but his memory was fuzzy, so he opted to focus on the village's center. Panamera inquired about his method for drawing the lines. She offered to assist by using a rope to measure lengths and link multiple lines for a precise layout. They started by measuring one side's length. Van saw Arut and asked if she felt safe without guards, and she nodded yes. With that, as they oversaw the surveying, they'd also reinforced the castle wall. Arut asked what that meant, so he described a ballista, a giant bow and arrow for village defense. The wall's top was broadened, and the ballista was enlarged. He crafted arrows the size of an adult's arm, with 2 levels allowing one ballista to shoot twice in succession. He considered a crossbow but feared errors. His first attempt was a bow too, and he didn't want to flop before 2 charming girls. They tested it with Cayman, and it worked flawlessly as he'd hoped. Arut was surprised by the bow's strength. Van said it far outpowered a standard bow and arrow. Panamera arrived, asking about the loud sound, thinking a huge magical beast was attacking. After Van clarified, she was quite taken aback. She asked if those ballistas were also atop the wall. Van said they varied slightly, but over 100 lined the defensive walls, with more planned ahead. She began probing about time, cost, and materials used. Van saw her curiosity but withheld details, calling it a military secret. Panamera was stunned. She vowed not to press for more and offered to buy a ballista at any cost, but Van grinned and said they weren't for sale. Panamera struggled to grasp how this distant village had advanced so much, defying norms of production, magic, and earning loyalty across races. As Viscount Panamera Carrera Cayenne, she felt a fresh breeze she hadn't known in years. She pledged an official pact with Van Neferro and planned to notify the capital today via letter. Usually, alliances within a nation aimed for protection, but she'd stressed this was an equal partnership. This would mark her as Van's ally among nobles, and betraying him would ruin her noble status. It was a golden chance for Van, who happily agreed to team up. As Van bowed to her, soldiers and maids followed suit. Panamera suggested that if he lent her a ballista, she'd loan him 100 soldiers for 2 weeks, but he'd owe her if even one went missing on return. Van agreed and asked if she needed a cart for transport and arrows to load. It seemed heavy, requiring a carriage, and she noted they could craft arrows from iron. Kamin approached, suggesting she take 1 or 2 of Van's arrows. He displayed a sword Van had forged for him. It appeared that Kamin looked up to Panamera and felt a special bond with her. Seeing this new facet of Kamin was intriguing. Panamera admitted she felt uneasy facing foes with armor and shields. She called them throwaway items, just her backups. She wished she could craft them herself, even if they were low quality or damaged. Kamin launched his initial strike. Panamera thought she blocked it, but it barely registered until she saw her sword split in 2. Stunned and puzzled, everyone watched as Panamera asked if Kamin's sword was iron, and Van clarified it was steel, crafted uniquely. He added that the bolts were steel arrows, slightly sharper than usual, able to puncture 2 or 3 carapace dragons. Panamera and her troops were floored by his skill once more. After that, she felt compelled to purchase those arrows. At night, Ordo and others chatted with Arut, urging her to look after Van if they wed. They'd be thrilled if someone as lovely as her joined their village. Arut felt flustered and shy discussing it, but Van stepped in, asking them to leave the guests alone. Though their casual remarks about him and Arut embarrassed him too, he stayed composed and told them to skip more drinks. He invited Arut to join them since the surveying was done. The construction would wrap up in about a month. Arut asked if he meant the street-facing wall section, and Van nodded yes. She was amazed the entire project would finish so soon. Usually, even a magically raised earthen wall would stay a dirt heap for a while. Van aimed to complete a set number of walls before a merchant, Lanthus, arrived. Arut asked if this merchant was trouble, but Van just smiled, saying he wanted to shock them fully. Panamera's team was skilled and hardworking. Then Asada took time to lay the fortress foundation once main supplies arrived. Building it himself, Van mounted ballista on top and finished the fortress by dinner. They pulled him away. 2 weeks later, the triangular fortress walls stood complete. Standard ballista were installed, twice the usual size, making village building more enjoyable. While Panamera praised his impressive work, Van's attention drifted to her large fortress, her ample chest. He refocused and thanked her for aiding with the fortress's core. Later, he suggested building homes for residents, merchants, and adventurers passing through or settling. Panamera had always dreamed of such a project, but it demanded hefty funds and time, and she couldn't borrow from a prince who just lost his land in battle. She refused his money so he could wield military might there freely. As they spoke, the ground trembled, and Ordo shouted that a dragon was approaching. Everyone was baffled about a dragon in this far-off spot. It was chasing Ordo and his crew, so they planned to stall it while others retreated to the village. Van was stunned that Ordo was making himself the bait. They could battle inside, but Van wasn't sure how to defeat such a massive dragon this time. He refused to let the villagers and others become its prey. His team awaited his instructions. Panamera chose to assist as the dragon neared. Van began issuing commands. He directed Ordo to draw the dragon aside while they countered with ballista. He told everyone to get ready to enter the wall's safety. Once Ordo and his group were inside, they shut the gate and climbed the wall to assist. Panamera instructed her soldiers to guide Princess Arut to the village with 10 men, ordering the rest to man the wall's top. Arut, more terrified than ever, stood frozen. Van recognized her fear, approached her, and offered reassurance. He explained that while the forest dragon was formidable, their ballista, backed by 4-element mage Asada and Panamera's aid, gave them strength. He admitted they hadn't beaten it yet, but vowed they wouldn't lose. Arut, calmed, prayed for success. Van assigned someone to watch over her indoors. Ordo shouted not to seal the gate yet, as they'd arrive soon. Van told the crew to prime the ballista, ensuring they didn't strike Ordo. Their initial goal was to ground it by targeting its wings. As they fled the dragon with all their might, Bull stumbled and urged them to leave her. Ignoring her, they drew the dragon's focus to give her time to rise and escape. Zara struck the dragon, but it barely noticed. He fled, sobbing and yelling for them to abandon him, stunned when they did, running the other way. Ordo, the swiftest, said he'd survive and insisted Bull reach the fortress first. Then he'd rejoin them. When Zara hesitated, Ordo cited Kasala's past sacrifice. Van commanded the ballista to fire when ready. Panamera claimed she could halt it single-handedly, determined to fell it in one strike. True to her night-level promotion, her power shone as a supreme four-element mage, just as Van predicted. She unleashed her flame javelin, but the dragon evaded the fierce blow. They followed with ballista, yet its keen eyes dodged most bolts. Only 5 struck. That should have slowed its body, wings, and legs. Van couldn't imagine their exhaustion, but large ballista reloaded slowly. He ordered a second volley prepared and fired as soon as possible. This shot missed entirely, though the first had dealt a deadly hit. Meanwhile, Ordo, Pool, and Zera reached the gate, unable to fully confront the dragon yet. Panamera launched another fire javelin to stall it while they retreated to the village. Its force awed Van, his first glimpse of elite fire magic, devastating against anything but a dragon. She then raced to the village to plan a counterstrike. Van urged everyone to dash there too. The dragon now perched on the fortress, its wings too injured to fly, reduced to running. Van felt sure he could handle it, having bested an armored lizard before, though this beast outmatched local monsters. Bidi arrived and urged him to head to the village while he bought some time, but he declined, knowing he couldn't face that enemy by himself. Di didn't push him further and instead began readying the combat equipment. Out of nowhere, Asada showed up and moved toward the dragon, paying no attention to Van's shouts. Van finally declared he wouldn't leave unless Asada came along. Asada paused but didn't look back, saying this could get complicated. He then asked Van to distract the dragon just once before they both pulled back. He instructed Van to lead the way, but Van refused to budge. As the dragon charged at them, Asada launched an attack to gain them a moment. Van pleaded with him to flee, but Asada's age made him too slow. Van offered his prized red wine to convince him to escape. Asada vowed to try his hardest. Kin stepped in, telling Van to guide the soldiers to shield the village while he looked after Asada. Getting back to the village fast, even at top speed, felt nearly impossible. Ordo and his crew were exhausted, leaving him unsure of his next move. Panamera contacted him, saying everything was set on her end. Van directed the soldiers to gear up for another strike. When Panamera asked for her role, Van was surprised she sought his guidance, but he stayed focused and told her to use her magic to pin the dragon if it neared the fort, just like before, then hit it with the ballista. Panamera agreed, though she'd never used her magic to freeze an enemy like that. It didn't matter much since they were up against an actual dragon. As the dragon emerged from the ruins and advanced, Van alerted everyone until Panamera was ready to cast her spell. He needed to safeguard Asada and the rest. Just a bit more time was all he required, and Dee stepped up to provide it. His soldiers assured Van they'd handle it. Though hesitant, they reassured him their gear, crafted by Van, would hold up. Dee and his group began their assault on the dragon. Dee's initial strike even severed one of its toes. Watching everyone push to stall the beast, Asada joined in with an attack of his own. Kamsen and Asada headed for the village, and Dee ordered a full retreat. Van was amazed they could move like that despite being hurt, especially Dee, the oldest, who outran them all. As the soldiers got close, Van signaled Panamera, who was prepared for any command. She unleashed her fire spear. Ballistas fired rounds from the village's west side. Ceast arrows flew toward the dragon. Many missed, but one landed a solid blow. Van commanded them to use every last shot. The dragon, though weakened, shielded its head, but the arrows pierced its body, causing deadly wounds. Van told the ballistas to ready more shots and wait, then asked Dee to inspect the dragon. Dee approached cautiously, and when he tapped its head with his sword, the dragon snarled, but Dee evaded and finished it with a single cut. Van exhaled in relief. He announced their victory and ordered a final shot to celebrate. Cheers erupted as they praised the triumph. Till and Arut rushed over, concerned, asking if Van was fine, and he replied he'd just done some running with Espa D and his 2 warriors who'd held off the dragon's onslaught. They went indoors, and Van sat to catch his breath. Panamera arrived, praising his sharp orders and congratulating him on his first dragon kill. Van couldn't fathom how it'd have gone without her, Asada, and D. Panamera admired his candor and noted that if that forest dragon had hit the prince's lands, half the city might be in ruins, with walls crumbling at minimum and hundreds dead. Van was stunned, thinking that if the royal mansion were in the city, it would have top-notch defenses. Panamera remarked that Dee and Asada would go down in history as heroes. The group felt a strong sense of pride, though Panamera pointed out that the ballista's weak shots only chipped the dragon's scales. Van realized he needed to boost their strength. Panamera proposed kicking off the Dragon's Conquest tribute first. She declared Dee had earned the Dragon Slayer title, then Van, the village leader, had secured the Warlord title, and Asada would be invited to join in too. Dee beamed with joy at being named Dragon Slayer. In the next part, Van told the crowd they'd triumphed over the forest dragon, and those who fought would be honored. The awards would come from Panamera Carla Cayenne, the current head of the Cayenne noble family. The villagers eagerly awaited her speech. She explained that the forest dragon's defeat was thanks to knights and wizards who battled fiercely to save the village. They stopped a threat that could have destroyed villages and their forts. Amazingly, their work meant no one in the village died, a huge success that earned them praise. She began with D, deputy chief knight of the fellow noble family. He'd taken the dragon's head and sealed the battle's fate, bringing his deep experience in war and weapons. Then came Asada, the respected four-element wizard. He used strong magic to hold the dragon back, making him the fight's second key player. When she named Van Philo, fourth son of the fellow noble family, the crowd erupted, chanting for him. At just 8 years old, his cleverness, tactics, and wisdom brought unseen magic to the fight. He quickly built and reinforced the village's defenses, becoming the battle's cornerstone with his incredible planning. As the village ruler, he led them to victory. Seeing the crowd shout his name, Van blushed, shyly waving back. The ceremony wrapped up, but a festival kicked off right after. Panamera tested a sword Van crafted and was amazed by its sharpness. She struggled to believe little Van made it all. He shrugged, saying it was just a basic sword from common materials. She was floored he'd forged hundreds of them solo. Van grinned and offered her a custom one for 5 gold coins. With the Panamera family's big army, they'd gathered materials fast. The warehouse overflowed, so he started an underground one. It was half done when street merchants rolled in with an armored lizard caravan. Lango arrived and was stunned by the village's new look. He quizzed Bell, who said there was a bigger issue to tackle. Van greeted them warmly. Lango shared that he'd roped in the trading firm's head, bringing 5 large caravans and 3 medium ones. 4 escorts, plus him, led the mercenaries, backed by 20 people and 5 slaves. Bell offered to show them the new warehouse. Seeing the dragon's body 10 body on the ground, the merchants freaked out. Van figured they were overreacting, but it was a massive forest dragon after all. Bell explained that the dragon's scales, claws, fangs, eyeballs, and magic stones were top-notch, and if auctioned in the capital, they'd fetch at least 100 platinum coins. He thought they might even hit 150 platinum coins. Van hadn't imagined the dragon could be valued at tens of billions of yen. He inquired about what would happen post-auction, and Bell clarified that it would occur in the capital, where pricey items always surfaced, drawing the Merchants Guild into the mix. With such unique goods, they'd surely fetch at least 150 platinum coins. Van figured there'd be costs for transport and sales too. He wondered if Bell and Lango could still earn a solid profit. Bell felt bad, realizing this might overwhelm an 8-year-old. A foolish noble might fault others for not gaining the upper hand, but Van was carefully considering their side. He said they'd take 3 to 5 platinum coins as their cut and still come out ahead. That made it worthwhile for them. Van asked if starting a trading firm was tough. Bell was caught off guard by the question and just stood there. Other merchants jumped in, promising him things. One claimed they were thinking of setting up a branch in the village, being the kingdom's top merchant group. Van questioned if the village's size would support that. The man replied that merchants don't just sell, they buy too, offering top goods at the best rates. Van asked the dragon's worth, and they said 80 platinum coins. He pressed on what they'd sell it for, and they explained it'd shrink after their sales fee. They also wanted to sell the armored lizard. Afterward, they'd send folks to visit the village. Their talk kept circling the battle's results. Once that faded, their interest in the village would likely drop. If monsters could be sold and they built a big store here, merchants would eat into profits, but he'd get top dollar for the dragon and lizards. They weren't tied to this place, their goal was money. He thanked them and said he'd think it over. They argued he was too young for merchant games, but Van brushed it off, suggesting they might have lowballed the dragon's price. Lango had pegged it at 100 platinum coins, not 8. The merchants pushed back, saying all traders chase big gains and hinting at bandits on the roads. Bell cut in, insisting on fairness. Sales and escort costs should come from profits. Even at the base auction price, they'd rake in plenty. Plus, smart merchants picked bandit-free routes. The older merchants fumed at Bell's words, calling him nuts. They griped that barely any traders hit this village yearly, and 80 platinum was fair. Each member would pocket at least 1 coin. One offered a high price to hush him up. Van could still hear though and didn't expect Bell to turn it down. But Bell refused shady tricks, vowing to deal straight, believing honesty would pay off big. Another merchant jumped in, cursing Bell and warning that the head merchant's wrath would ruin them. They stormed off like Van hadn't heard a thing. Despite his noble roots, he'd only heard good about the merry merchants. Even if the customer was just a young child unlikely to return often, keeping good communication was still key to preserving ties with current customers. Van inquired if they were concerned about losing one platinum coin, and they replied that it wasn't an issue. Although their identities were known, their merchant group affiliation remained a mystery. Rango felt they didn't deserve to be called real merchants. They had no desire to join a large merchant group like the one in question, preferring to trade on their own by hiring protection. Bell could transport the goods to the capital, but they needed to register them with the guild before the auction. He explained that joining the auction required 3 things: borrowing a lot of money for a trade union membership, owning an original shop, and getting noble support. The first 2 were easy, but the noble support part was complicated. Noble company rules give nobles full legal power. Those who start a trading firm get rewards from a noble, while the nobles sit back and reap huge profits. Van asked how much it would cost to sell the dragon or what profit percentage they wanted per sale. Bell was pleased with his choice to join them and said a sales fee was needed, which could change based on market rates. When Van asked which noble the main merchant group was tied to, the 2 brothers paused briefly. They finally revealed they worked with the country's ruler, the Berliner nobility. Once the firm was established, nobles would recommend it to higher nobles. The company would grow larger and stronger, and by treating customers well, they could keep a good reputation and noble support. Still, Van thought having royalty favor them was unfair. Bell noted that the Mary Corporation owned shops in all the best spots nationwide, allowing knights to sell rare materials and slaves they captured there first. They also earned every lord's endorsement. Rango added that Mary Triumph, the first head of Mary Corporation, was rumored to be an ancient king's mistress. Other companies always watched them closely. If someone got caught in a scandal, it could lead to everyone dropping their support. Van wondered if the Merchant Guild had links to major groups across many countries. Since their headquarters was located in a different country, they figured they'd be okay as long as they followed all the rules, and Bell gave her approval, noting that they could set up their shop because of her support. Bell almost offered her own home as a suggestion, but Van interrupted, explaining that they couldn't rely on his family's connections since his father had disowned him and his brother had no noble status. The only noble he knew who might assist was Panamera, his sole ally, and he promised to try talking to her, which made the merchant brothers so thrilled they didn't even hear him clarify that he was only going to ask. He also thought of Panamera because this could spell trouble for her. When Van approached Panamera to ask for her help, she agreed without hesitation, saying that as a new noble, she had little to lose by backing 2 small businesses, and they might even shake up the royals if they could apply some pressure. Van hadn't considered that the royalty had their own issues, and he wondered if his commoner background shaped his thinking. Panamera explained that she lacked land or a knight order, so if she wanted to rise, she'd need to make a bold move to catch the commoner's attention. This request suited her well because 100 private soldiers had taken down a dragon, which could serve as a dramatic way to enter the palace scene. It was true, no one in the far-off villages would expect they'd be ready to defeat a dragon. Van got excited, realizing that if Panamera took all the credit, his family wouldn't notice him, which was exactly what he wanted. She pointed out that it was a dragon slain with few losses, and any nosy guesses or information would catch the higher noble's attention. If this deal grew big, details like the materials, the method of the fight, the number of fighters, the location, casualties, and more would come to light, possibly drawing in the royal knights and others. Van's excitement faded as he realized that even if he said Panamera was the one who beat the dragon, they'd still dig into it and find out it was him. The thought of being dragged back home made his spirit sink. Panamera was surprised to see a young guy fresh out of his house so stressed, so she stepped closer and told him she'd show him a way to stay out of it. Van looked at her curiously as she suggested he just become a noble himself to gain independence and start his own house. She made it sound as easy as setting up a new place to live, even acting out a scenario where she claimed he defeated the dragon and she did nothing. He freaked out, saying that would make him too noticeable, but she simply asked what the issue was with that. The real problem was that she was standing so close her chest was right in Van's face, though he tried to stay composed. He wasn't sure about chasing nobility. His father's reaction was unpredictable. His younger brothers might stir up trouble, and becoming a noble before the king's oldest son would definitely draw eyes. Panamera argued that an 8-year-old boy taking down a dragon would boost him into the ranks and earn him a fortune, plus a growing company, all great outcomes. Still, she got why he was nervous. She'd made enemies when she became a noble, and some tried to exploit her, but she crushed them all. She advised him to strike his enemies hard so no one would dare oppose him after he took down a few. Her harsh words made Van see how brutal the world could be. He pointed out that if he took all the credit, she wouldn't get any fame, but Panamera calmly said she didn't need an 8-year-old worrying about her life. Van felt her intimidating vibe and quickly backtracked. now more concerned for himself than her, not wanting to get on her bad side. She laughed and told him to relax, she wouldn't eke him. For the next 5 years, while he grew stronger, she'd let him have the credit. It felt like Van only had 5 years left to make his mark. 2 days later, Bee offered him 130 platinum coins for the forest dragon, and he quickly agreed without a second thought. The deal went smoothly, and Panamera's condition was that she'd take a cut of any business he did once he became a baron. When Rango returned to the capital, they sold the forest dragon and armadillo dragon as materials. Rango warned that their slow pace might catch up with them, and Belle wondered how they'd face the merchant guild with nothing to show. Panamera was pretty sure the merchants were crying for help by now, unable to handle the load on their own. If that happened, they'd have no choice but to sell it all for 80 platinum coins, which seemed both harsh and practical. Rango suggested they could build a carriage to transport everything and might ask Koro's party to guard them. But Panamera insisted she'd bring her army to the capital instead. She reminded Van to promote himself for his nobility goal, so he wouldn't need to stress about manpower or protection. Van thanked her with genuine joy, and seeing him happy for once made Panamera blush. She warned him not to blurt out every thought in his head. Van nearly fainted when he saw her cheeks turn red. Belle asked if it'd be fine since they needed a huge carriage and lots of horses to haul the dragons, but Van had it covered. He built a massive, lightweight platform carriage using wooden blocks, covered the materials with cloth, and Panamera supplied trained military horses to pull it. The merchants were still traveling, gossiping negatively about Van and Belle as they went. Suddenly, they spotted strange, oversized carriages and knights approaching. Confused and nervous, they wondered who sent them. It didn't look like a noble's carriage since it was so enormous. As it passed, they saw Vi, Count Cayenne, and Rango inside, which baffled them further. One merchant realized that if Belle and Rango got noble support, they'd climb the merchant guild ranks fast. At this rate, their hard work delivering to the border would be for nothing, and they'd take a loss. Their deal relied on the armadillo dragon and its 40 items, so returning empty-handed would ruin their merchant group status. They brainstormed ways to save themselves, and one suggested claiming Belle and Rango exploited their goodwill and deceived them. They turned back, hoping the guild would buy their story. In the Scuteria kingdom, King Dino of Shorabellin took the throne at 16 and transformed the military by 20, outshining his ancestors with incredible power. He stopped betrayals, sidelined his relatives, sacked many commanders, and turned lower officials into fierce warriors, building a strength-focused army. It took time, effort, and plenty of bloodshed. Nobles had to become officers or vice commanders, no exceptions. This shook things up. Weaker houses like Count Phonitz lost influence, while military-strong houses like Mark Phonitz gained ground. King Dino personally granted Panamera a noble rank, recognizing her skill. She came from a family of knights in the capital, and once her magic talent showed, she was sent to a count's land for intense training. She gave up sleep to study and pushed herself hard. Her efforts paid off when she became captain of a small team, and her success led her to command the count's knights at just 16 years old. Panamera had achieved a great deal since then, including joining the war against the Kingdom of Veneta, where her leadership turned the tide of the conflict. After that, she was made a noble, though they used her as a knight under the pretext of granting her a title. His Majesty was pleased with her success, and within just 6 years, awarded her the rank of Viscount. He mentioned that he expected her to ask for an even higher rank herself given her recent feats, but she surprised him by suggesting it go to someone else instead. The king asked who this person was that she was recommending. Panamera explained it was one of the kingdom's feudal lords, someone without a substitute or representative and unable to come to the capital. When the king questioned why she'd nominate such a lord, she said it was for his future potential and the accomplishments he could achieve. The king found it thrilling that a respected military figure like her would praise someone else, but he grew skeptical about a lord with barren land, no knights, and no soldiers. How could he have done anything noteworthy? The room fell silent when Panamera revealed it was a dragon subjugation. They wondered if it was a 4-elemental mage raised there, but she clarified that he couldn't use magic, despite his family's fame for it, which led to his exile. The king's curiosity spiked as she named him Van Fellow, son of Maris Fellow, an 8-year-old hero who had slain a dragon. The king was stunned since the Marquis hadn't reported this, but Panamera confirmed she'd spoken to Van and the villagers herself. It happened in a tiny village of barely 100 people, constantly harassed by thieves. When Van arrived, he defended it, wiping out the bandits with a handful of followers and some hired adventurers. Then he fortified the village with mud walls and fixed up their damaged homes. The court struggled to believe a 6-year-old could pull this off, But Panamera went on, detailing his small team, just over 100 villagers, the Marquis vice captain of the knights, an elderly mage, and 5 adventurers. Though she'd helped with the dragon's subjugation by holding it back, it was Van and the feudal Lord Bon Neo who finished it off without losing a single person. This sounded unbelievable, so they demanded proof. Panamera pointed to the dragon's materials and an extra 40 armored lizards, numbers that shocked them, as even the royal knights couldn't easily take down that many lizards. She admitted she couldn't fully convince them in this heated discussion, but she checked with the villagers Van led, and their accounts lined up with the reports. The king didn't suspect Panamera of lying, though it seemed odd she'd give credit to a child who could be easily swayed. They asked if someone had granted Van his land, and she confirmed it, adding that he'd be at the dragon's inspection in a few days, so there was no need to overcomplicate things. And Knight warned her that if this turned out to be a scheme, she'd lose her rank and face punishment. Panamera accepted the risk and even asked the king to attend, suggesting he might grant Van new lands to protect for the kingdom's sake. The king was eager to meet Van as the dragon was brought in, leaving people in awe. Panamera declared Van fellow baron, with his rewards for slaying the forest dragons to be settled later. The court was floored, especially since they knew Van. She also told Bell and Rango they could now deal with the guild and start their business. Rango was overjoyed, and when Panamera asked if he used his brother's name too, he said he was just glad his little brother's name was getting out there. The following day, the launch of the new business and whispers of Van Fellow becoming a baron exploded into the biggest story across the capital. People hailed Van as a hero who took down a dragon, with wild tales claiming a young, powerful swordsman sliced off its head, far-fetched even for gossip. Panamera's role had been overshadowed, but she didn't mind, finding the buzz around Van intriguing too. She'd hoped he'd be grateful for her help. A month and a half earlier, Panamera's group had left the village, and since then, Van had crafted loads of ballista. With only about 100 residents, they wouldn't use them all, but his place had grown fancy and shifted to the village center for convenience and charm. They'd also built 2 towers. Kin loved the Oringo Tower for its street views, while Till preferred the Voodoo Tower for the lake scenery. Dee spotted Van and asked if he was heading up Oringo Tower, but since Van chose that one, Dee opted for Voodoo instead. Climbing the tower took 10 minutes and left them wiped out. Common handled it fine, but Till and Van were beat. When they reached the top, the stunning view made it worth it. Van wondered if the tower was overkill for a village of just 100. Till pointed out that with their buildings and gear, it didn't feel like a village anymore. Maybe they should call it a city. Though he'd shot down Van's village before, the name still floated around, and he figured Till might jokingly dub it Van Town next. Till didn't flinch at Van's teasing tone and insisted it was a solid name. Van thought she was poking fun at him now. Common called Van over to look at something, but Van couldn't spot it. Kin's sharp eyes outdid the villagers. He said they didn't seem like soldiers or adventurers. There were lots of kids, elderly folks, and even a slave trader. Shocked, Van decided to eat first since it'd take them an hour to arrive. Till brought Van's favorite egg rolls and a sandwich, made with top-notch bread thanks to Bell. As they ate, Alti showed up. Panamera had returned to the capital, but Alti chose to stay for now. Van asked what was happening, nearly dropping formalities since he felt like an adult talking to a kid. She was adorable, though he had no romantic feelings, just an urge to pat her head when she acted this way. Lost in how cute she was, he barely noticed Alti asking him to just call her Alti since the full title seemed tough for him. Van agreed and asked why she'd come. She explained that a crowd was heading their way and fretted about what to do. They had nothing inside the city walls. Should they take them to his office? Van noticed her speech getting casual as she warmed up to him, though she still got annoyed at times. Van suggested they talk at the house and confirm the newcomers were friendly first. Till mentioned that Oro's party had gone into the forest that morning. Van told him to fetch Dee and Asada. Common left to get them. Van thought about training between his building projects, impressed by Kin's hard work. Kin endured Dee's brutal training alone, and though he didn't realize it, his sword skills had surpassed Van's. Ab and Lou trained as rivals too, and Van wondered if he lacked something beyond stamina. When Alti praised Common's skills, Van realized that, like back home, the cool kids here were the fast, athletic ones. Asada told Van the group was from another village and offered to bring their leader to his room. A sweaty man arrived, asking if this was Seat Village. They'd expected a simple place but were stunned to find a grand city instead. Van turned to Asada, asking if he knew anything about this. Asada explained that a man named Seat once lived here and left such an impression that the village became known as the Village of Seat. Van was stunned, feeling deceived since he'd been told the village had no name. Asada admitted he'd kept quiet, hoping Van would name it Van's Village, and wondered what was up with this guy. Asada confirmed it was indeed the village of Seat. Van asked what the man wanted, still reeling from how much had changed. It was almost unbelievable. Losing patience, Van shouted, demanding to know why he was there. The man explained they were from a nearby village where the young population had dwindled, but the taxes stayed the same. They couldn't keep going like that, so they came to ask if they could join the village of Seat. Migration sounded tough, and Van wondered why they were losing youth. He asked if they left to earn money but chose to stay here instead. The man clarified that the younger ones didn't leave willingly. They were drafted as soldiers, leaving the village without enough hands to pay the taxes, and the Count didn't care about a border village like theirs. Van pointed out that their villages seemed pretty far apart. The man said it took an adult 2 weeks to travel here, and they chose this village over the city because they feared the Count's punishment if he caught them. They figured the VI Count's village was safer. If the Count was cautious, he wouldn't have taken them in. It could look like Van was stealing his people, sparking trouble. Still, these folks risked their lives to get here. Van wanted to avoid clashing with the Count or his family, but he couldn't ignore people in need. Van asked if they all planned to live here and assured them he wouldn't tax them for now. They'd have food and shelter and could work together for the village. 13 had come today, but they totaled 300. He warned that each family would get just one house, so they shouldn't expect too much. The man asked if Van was sure he could treat them so well, even offering a grandchild, which irritated Van. It infuriated him that people here tossed kids around like holiday presents. He knew feudal lords often offered daughters, but it still disgusted him. Van offered to lend them carriages and asked if 2 horses would do. The man declined horses, saying they could use the cows they had back home instead. Van's interest peaked when he heard about the cows. The man explained the Count left them to raise, and they birthed 5 or 6 calves yearly, growing to about 10 cows annually. Van thought that was great and said they could bring the cows here, with Ortho escorting them. He offered the village chief rest for the day, assuming he was exhausted, but the man said he wasn't the chief. People were amazed they'd sleep in such a place. Some said it felt grander than a feudal lord's mansion, while others guessed the lord might have lent it out. Van, though, knew his furniture was far superior. He cut in, announcing a welcome feast and a trip to the big bath. He told Cayman to inform the villagers and guide the cook. Hal asked what he planned for them, and Van realized she was the Count's daughter. He hadn't meant to cause trouble and explained they were villagers from a nearby place who couldn't stay there, so he was offering food and shelter for now. Alti looked relieved and said they'd have a good life here. Van was glad she didn't press about their origins as they walked together. He asked how she'd liked her 2 months here and if she wanted to stay. Alti said she'd be happier living here. Van noted they were still kids, so she could forget marriage talk and just tell him what she wanted. That's what mattered. Alti seemed anxious but said she'd love to marry him. Van playfully asked Alti if she really wanted to marry him, hoping to fluster her further, but he saw himself as a gentleman who'd never humiliate a lady, so he told her to drop the idea. Alti agreed, then noticed his odd stride. Van brushed it off as a happy walk, saying boys feel sky-high when they get popular. Just then, Oro's team stumbled into the village, wounded. Ortho revealed they'd found a dungeon entrance, and Van froze. This was the one he'd hoped to avoid, filled with yellow birds, strange merchants, or small monsters. Asada leaned on Van, warning that since they'd discovered it, they had to report it to the capital right away. He asked if his father would snatch them up if they didn't, and Van admitted it was certain. Reporting to the royal capital first was the smartest move. Van had wanted to become a noble before this mess, so his land could gain some renown, but now they were stuck. He began plotting an adventurer guild branch, armory shops, and since they'd attract rough types, maybe a host club and casino too. Ortho apologized profusely, but Van said it was unavoidable now that it was found. He wanted someone to ride to the capital with the news and picked Kira for the job. Kira seemed nervous about going solo, but Van pointed out he'd sniffed out the dungeon anyway with his curiosity, so he couldn't complain. Ortho agreed Kira was perfect, but wanted to tag along. Van insisted he stayed to guard the incoming villagers, offering a big gold coin as a reward instead. At the mention of gold, the group ditched Kira and wished him luck. Seeing Kira's glum face, Van handed him a mithril dagger. When the others saw it, they flipped, suddenly eager to go alone. Ortho and the crew left to escort the new villagers, while Kira headed to the royal capital. Kira was thrilled on his trip, admiring the sunset with his new dagger, glad Van gave it to him. It was so easy to wield. He camped overnight, and the next day, the journey flew by with him fixated on the blade. Just a few kilometers from the capital, he spotted a carriage under attack by orcs. Orcs, no matter the kind, were driven by base urges: food, sleep, desires, and violence. He figured this one would either harm or attack whoever was inside. It'd have been tough without the dagger, but Kira thought it was child's play now. He took down the orcs effortlessly, even warning the others to back off for their own good before finishing them, marveling again at Van's custom mithril dagger. A little girl emerged from the carriage, thanking him for saving her. Her name was Amelia Stust, and she assumed he was some high-status figure, asking his name. Kira panicked, but introduced himself as a plain adventurer. His fine clothes and that remarkable dagger made her doubt it. She figured he was hiding a big name. He tried to explain, but she wasn't convinced. She said she'd walk to the royal capital from here, with nothing to repay him now, promising to do so later. Kira said he was capital-bound too, and offered her a ride on his horse. She didn't want to burden him, but he was already lifting her onto the horse, joking he'd prefer a lady like her over him. Amelia was moved, saying it'd been ages since anyone called her a lady. She was 30. Kira didn't buy it. She didn't look past 20. He asked where she was headed, and she explained her escort had abandoned her along the way. Kira asked Amelia why she was heading to the capital. She explained that her father, a VI count, had died in battle, their house was seized, and their family name had lost its standing. Now she was searching for a household that might need maids. She felt shy admitting this, but Kira wasn't one to judge. He figured she was a freelancer like him. He told her he lived in a border village and invited her, saying there'd be a good job for her and he'd keep the place safe. Amelia was glad to meet Kira and happily accepted his offer. They went to the Adventurers Guild and reported a dungeon discovery near the border, under Marcus Fellow's land. The guild announced it was near the same village that had taken down a forest dragon and armored lizards. The feudal lord Van Fellow was a new baron, and the guild planned to set up a branch there, buying materials at a 20% markup. Anyone who mapped the dungeon usefully would get a reward. The adventurers cheered, pestering Kira with questions about Van and the dungeon. Kira grabbed Amelia, saying they were leaving, and they roamed the capital until it was time to go, though the adventurers trailed them despite being told not to. Kira covered Amelia's food and inn-room. She felt bad for only taking his help, but he shrugged it off and asked if she was sure about joining him. Amelia said it had been ages since she'd smiled so genuinely, all thanks to him. Kira beamed and started talking about Van, calling him a sharp kid with big potential. Amelia grew excited to meet him and see the village he described. Meanwhile, Ortho and his team were guiding the neighboring villagers to Van's village. Ortho figured Kira had gone straight to the capital. Imperial warned them to stay sharp after the forest dragon mess. They'd been too chatty last time. Ortho tried to protest, but Puriel shut him down. They were shocked by the villagers' numbers and even more stunned that everyone wanted to leave. Ortho had seen people die without ever seeing beyond their village, yet they endured starvation. Uprooting wasn't simple. He noticed a woman staggering but refusing the carriage. She had more grit than those riding. He asked if she was all right. She admitted she opposed the move, expecting a worse village. Ortho assured her this border village was paradise, better than any city. She didn't fully grasp it, but when they arrived and he pointed out the walls, they were all floored. The villagers were greeted with a festival and warm smiles, including Van's. He figured they were exhausted, so he offered a barbecue to bond and rest in their assigned homes. The village chief, Spell, thanked Van for taking them in. Van introduced himself and credited Ortho with saving them all. Ortho said it was just adventurer work. Puriel asked if the meat was from another monster. Van explained 10 giant evil boars had emerged from the lake yesterday. He panicked when he saw them coming. Ortho noted those boars paralyze you with magic if you got close, but their ballista took them out in one shot. A young child from the neighboring village asked if he could eat, and Van told him to hold on, asking Till to fetch the soup he'd mentioned and roast some small-sized meat for him. They served heaps of food to everyone, and the newcomers were overjoyed. Some even teared up as they ate, savoring delicious meat after so long. Seeing their delight warmed Van and his villagers' hearts just as much. Van was relieved he'd worked hard to prepare enough houses and a barbecue for 300 people before they arrived. With support from his crew, especially Pill, he'd done the bulk of it. Now he just needed to plan the outskirts for adventurers. He envisioned a small town outside the village, not built for safety but as a rest stop for dungeon goers. It'd be a good spot, he thought, to keep crime and shady folks out of the village. He aimed to build a town in about a month. Ortho listened, stunned, as Van described a town for 400 people, with a vibe suited for travelers and adventurers. Tall buildings would house dozens, including 5 for business, and 2 or 3 within 500-meter walls armed with 3 ballista. He'd add 15 ballista total for defense, locked to avoid misuse. Asada noted the Adventurer Guild branch would go there too, suggesting Van prep the town for them. It was just talk. but he wondered if Van would run the shops and inns himself. Van said they'd profit more if they managed it, requiring extra effort but worth it. Asada advised having a representative since Van handled the village. Someone needed to oversee the town. Van asked if that meant one person for all shops, or if multiple shopkeepers could manage it. Asada suggested splitting it among several people. Ispat added they might form a night army, and with D around, plus transport and facilities, they could figure out town safety. Thieves or troublemakers might show up, so Van planned to run some stores himself, let Bell and Rango handle the rest, and scout adventurers for a night army. He offered Asada the representative role, managing and hiring talent. Van asked if one army could cover both village and town. He was confident D would lead Seat Village's army, and the new one would be the Aspa army. Asada caught on, asking if this was payback. Van checked on the party, hoping no fights had broken out. Erut wanted to join him, but Van needed to chat with villagers and didn't want to seem rude, so he offered her meat while they talked. Till and Compion trailed them excitedly, watching as they ate and walked. Van noticed a chair shortage and asked a strong villager to grab 3. The man eagerly brought them, and Van suggested he join Seat's night army, still in the works, asking him to think it over. Proud of snagging a recruit before Espa, Van started eyeing other warrior types. Villagers approached, asking how they could help. Thrilled by the manpower, he tasked them with assisting at the upcoming stores and inns. They were fine with farming but new to business. Van reassured them they'd handle customers, organize goods, and clean, plenty of jobs to try what suited them. He promised fair pay for all. An old man remarked the village was in top shape. He thought he was in the wrong place until Van appeared. They never imagined a life of smiles and joy, hoping it'd last. Van said it was just the beginning. They'd make every day fun together. The village was growing, with more citizens and visitors, all while they'd only aimed to survive. B grinned, announcing they were building another town right now. In the next scene, they rallied more villagers to help out. The stronger ones were working a kilometer away from the village, constructing a new town for adventurers. SP pointed out it was uneven, so they instructed them to tug the rope to the right. For the elderly newcomers, Van assigned them to tend the cows on the farm, something they were familiar with. The Ag Gallus would handle feeding them water and grass. The new kids were thrilled to settle into their homes and explore the village's huge walls alongside Seat's children. Van was glad the population was growing. They approached, asking if he needed more logs. Van requested 100 more by day's end and noticed D was already forming a night squad, though they'd already signed up with SP. Van realized he'd lagged behind, but luckily, some hadn't committed yet. He snagged a few, planning to make D the captain with Ab and Lou as vice captains for a 20-man squad. Small, but he told himself to relax and give Asada a breather. Kin rushed in, reporting a horse and medium-sized carriage in the distance. It was Kusara, trailed by several others. Van thanked him, teasing that he shouldn't see that far. Till and Alti couldn't spot it either until they got closer, revealing a woman beside Kusara. Till guessed he'd rescued her and won her heart. Alti was awestruck, and even Kin praised Kusara's agility, enemy detection, trap disarming, and unique sword skills, plus his knack for stone throwing, knife throwing, and archery. As they chatted about Kusara, he rolled up, jokingly asking them to stop trash-talking him so loudly. Van played innocent, welcoming him and asking about the woman. Kusara said he'd met her somewhere, and since she had nowhere to go, he brought her along. The villager count was climbing, and he asked if that was fine. When Van mentioned 300 new residents, Kusara was floored. Till introduced herself and Van to Philia, who shared her name. She recounted being attacked by orcs near the capital, saved by Kusara, who then brought her here, just as Till had predicted. Kusara downplayed it, but Philia insisted he outshone any storybook hero. Till and Alti buzzed with excitement. Van then noticed the group behind Kusara, adventurers eager for jobs. Kusara apologized. After reporting to the guild, these cash-hungry folks tagged along. Worried they'd spook the villagers, he suggested they camp outside, but Van wanted their goodwill and good word about the village. He asked them to hang tight, promising inns soon with basic defenses. He told Kusara to rest in the village and asked about their plans. Van explained Ortho was scouting the dungeon, but its tricky location ruled out a camp. Kusara grinned, saying it was his moment to shine, head rest today and flex his skills tomorrow. As Kusara waved, Philia bowed gracefully, hinting at her noble roots, and excused herself. Alti whispered that she was from the Stratos Viscount house. Van asked Alti if she knew Philia, and Alti said she'd heard of her before. Her father, a male aristocrat, had died, and their struggling family had finally collapsed. Till felt sorry for her, guessing they were about the same age, but when Alti revealed Philia was in her 30s, they were all stunned. Van decided they should steer clear of asking women their age. He shifted focus to building the town, setting shops aside for now, and prioritized temporary shelters and defensive walls. He wanted a wall strong enough to stop a medium-sized monster, giving everyone time to retreat deeper into the village if trouble hit. As he spoke, some adventurers approached and started picking on them, warning that even near the village, the outside was risky. They called them brats and flirted with Till and Alti. Van was momentarily dumbfounded by their boldness, then asked Till if she was worried. She said they were strange but nice. Van found them intimidating, but others explained the White Oath group looked rough but were decent at heart. Van figured White Oath was what the D-Day crew called their party. The adventurers grew curious about why they were there. Van assured them they'd head back to the village at the first sign of danger, so it'd be fine. They'd heard from the guild about a young, wealthy VI count leading a big group. Van wondered who this young, capable noble was. He'd never heard of them. One adventurer asked what he was up to, and Van said he was waiting for wood. He showed their meager supplies and, despite the rough look, built a temporary fence for the night's safety. Everyone was amazed. Van thought they doubted its strength, so he explained it was sturdier than it appeared and would last a week. They corrected him. It was incredible magic. Dee arrived with 30 logs and called Van's name, making the adventurers realize this kid was Van Fellow. Dee got furious, drew his sword, and challenged the loudmouth to a duel. Even Van was spooked. The adventurers egged him on, but Dee sliced their swords in half with one swing. Known as the strongest dragon-slaying knight, Dee's reputation spread fast. Newcomers greeted him nervously, and he warned them against trouble. Van wasn't sure how to feel but hoped to keep things secure. People were drawn to Van as both a kid and a leader, swarming him with questions like why he was at the border. He explained he'd been exiled from his family. Ortho showed up mid-conversation, surprised by the crowd. Van asked when he'd returned. Ortho said they'd lingered too long at the dungeon but finally came back. He wondered how many adventurers were around and if Kusara was back. Van mentioned the stunning woman he brought, shocking the team. Kusara and Philia arrived. Kusara had come to check on them since they were late. He said guild staff would arrive for inspections within a day, so they'd scout tomorrow. Philia called to him, and he explained her presence, introducing her to his adventurer pals. Kusara wanted to help, but seeing them back, headed to the inn instead. Ortho and the others were floored, asking if it was a dream. Van recounted how Kusara heroically saved her from orcs, and she saw him as a hero. It was true, so Van welcomed them, even considering a small house for them nearby. Their jealous reactions made him pause. They regretted missing out and envied Kusara. Once they settled, Van asked about the dungeon. Piriel said the monster stayed inside, and the entrance, near a cliff, was in a treacherous spot even for a forest. It was deep with a narrow opening for just 2 people. They checked it out. Stairs led to the first floor, flanked by pillars, with walls, a ceiling, and light crystals. It was definitely a dungeon. Van asked Piriel if the dungeon was far, and she said it was an hour by carriage plus 2 to 3 hours through the forest. Van was taken aback, but noted that dungeons were often like that. He figured the border's tough monsters might cluster far from safer areas, reasoning no one would settle a village in such a risky spot, though he still saw potential for one nearby someday. Piriel warned that the dungeon's surroundings teemed with huge monsters, and its natural layout was treacherous, making small camps possible but a full base unfeasible. Van was puzzled by her tone. She seemed oddly confident, claiming he could build a perfect base there. Van countered that the forest was too wild for his ballista, but Piriel vowed to protect him, boasting her team's dungeon experience made it safe. She pushed suspiciously hard, but Van, aiming to be cautious, wasn't buying it. He jokingly said he'd go if they carried him to the entrance, added afternoon naps and desserts, and let him bring Till, Kin, and Alti as servants. Dee and Asada would stay busy with the town, so he'd need plenty of guards too. He thought Piriel would balk, but she grinned, promising to prep by tomorrow, leaving Van stunned. She told Ortho they were taking Van and to get ready. Even the eavesdropping servants were floored. 3.5 hours after leaving the village, Van found himself dungeon-bound to set up a base, something he'd never imagined. He took in the scenery as Alti praised the fresh air, though the bumpy ride was hard to ignore. Their target was the dungeon, and they'd rallied 50 adventurers. They rode a lightweight shrine platform Van had made, but the jolting felt like it could toss them out any moment. Beyond the forest, they passed caverns, cliffs, and scattered corpses, now part of the view. When Van muttered he hadn't expected this, Common reminded him he'd agreed to it. Van wrestled with motion sickness, but the girls treated it like a fun road trip. The distant mountains, towering above the clouds, awed them, and a flying monster left them gaping, though Van just saw it as a threat, grabbing his crossbow in case it swooped. Hearing his name, he peeked out and instantly yelled for everyone to stop. 2 wooden planks served as a bridge, and he was horrified. Confused, they asked why he halted them so close to the dungeon. Van shouted to move it to a wider spot, appalled by the adventurer's recklessness. Even steeplejacks would quiver here. He realized adventurers rarely prioritize safety and ordered them to fix this death trap where one misstep could kill. Mentioning danger and risk management, the adventurers exchanged puzzled looks, unsure if they had such a concept. He made them kneel and rethink their approach as they struggled to grasp the issue. Spotting Kusara hopping around, Van asked what he was doing and what had happened if he kicked the log hard. He warned that even someone as agile as Kusara could plummet if the planks rolled or snapped. Van told them to either reinforce the bridge or find a safer route, asking what they thought should be done with the log. One suggested lining up more logs, prompting Van to make them kneel again, scolding them for their lack of sense. He insisted the correct solution was a solid bridge and stressed confirming safety before crossing. They grumbled about time constraints, but when Van threatened to ditch the base if they kept whining, they jumped into action. He eyed the dungeon entrance, hemmed in by cliffs and hills with little room, a tricky spot for a base. Till asked what was bothering him, but before he could reply, a man interrupted, asking for input on key facilities. When Van inquired, the man proposed a hostess club and got shot down instantly. Van made them kneel again, explaining a casino wasn't needed either. It was a tough sell. He began by crafting a dungeon door and a water system from the river. The base would sit beside the entrance on a handy slope, linking it smoothly. Alti asked if he was set on this design, and he assured her it was. After 4 non-stop hours, the base was done. Once Van gave the go-ahead, everyone piled in. Ground floor had a rest area and storage. The first floor featured a canteen and 3 sleeping rooms, and the 3rd and 4th floors held 6 more. Built with balance in mind, it was sturdy. They could use the terrace however they liked. The adventurers were floored by the setup. 4 toilets per floor, rooftop tanks with filtering nets for rainwater, though he warned against drinking it. He handed management to Ortho, asking him to lead well, and about the dungeon door, should it stay closed when possible or set open hours. Ortho suggested consulting the group since some dove at night, but agreed it should close when empty to delay anything nasty escaping. The mithril interior could hold a forest dragon for a day, and steel bars backed the windows so monsters weren't a worry. More windows would brighten it, but he advised shutting them when not in use. It was afternoon, so Van said they should head back, ordering escorts prepped. The adventurers, surprised by the daylight, wanted to nap first, but Van cited his curfew. Asada would chew him out. They found it hilarious that the Lord feared his servant's wrath, noting he was still a kid despite his title. Van got stern, warning there'd be no dinner if they dawdled, which only made them laugh harder and tease him more. On the return, they hit another cliff. Van couldn't fathom how they'd crossed it. It was a death trap. They built 2 more bridges before exiting the forest and finally reached the village. As the sun set and they reached the village, Van spotted Asada waiting with Aspa. For once, Asada was smiling instead of his usual blank stare, which terrified Van. Asada asked for a private word, but Van, spooked, pleaded for backup. The others couldn't even meet Asada's gaze. Till bravely tagged along, though Common and Alti refused. Van begged Ortho to step in, blaming them for the mess, but Asada silenced Ortho and dragged Van off, lecturing him until midnight. In the next scene, on the capital's outskirts, a Slav market churned. A girl unable to wield the 4 elements was stuck with chores, singing, and dancing. Hunters like her faced worse treatment as more Slavs were sold off. The market buzzed about a man buying every Slav there. Someone called him spoiled, noting a few could have been mistresses, but they were all headed to a remote mountain to mine for life. The girl wondered if she'd ever find meaning or just perish there. Meanwhile, at Seat Village, a caravan rolled into the adventurers' town. Rango was back with a crowd and horses. Van pictured a heartfelt brotherly reunion, but Bell cut in, asking Rango how much he'd sold for. Rango reported 108 platinum coins, and after planning ahead, he bought 150 debt Slavs, all healthy, in their 20s or younger. Bell was stunned he paid 3 platinum each, totaling 8 big gold coins post-auction at Maria's guild. Rango tried discussing carriages, but the guild apologized, saying it'd be a hassle if they couldn't trade with Van, so they slashed prices by half. Van greeted Rango, noting the big group. Rango promised introductions later, handing over 130 platinum coins as agreed. Van thanked him, passing them to Till, and Rango added 2 platinum coins as Van's share, promising a cut of future profits. Van expressed gratitude, and Rango vowed to sell monster materials to him first, seeing it as a mutual win. Then Rango dropped the bombshell. Van was officially a baron now, leaving him floored. His father couldn't reclaim the land or strip his lordship anymore. Kin asked if Panamera was coming herself, but Rango said the VI Count would hurry over after reporting to the Count. She'd rather align with Van than her Count's faction, finding this land more exciting to develop. Van hadn't expected her to want to settle here. He liked her, but not as a boss, making it a tricky spot. Next, in the village square, they interviewed the newcomers, showcasing standout talents: a former VI Count's daughter, an ex-knight, a knight's daughter, a wind attribute user, an earth attribute user, a former B-rank adventurer, a fallen company director's daughter, and an ex-knight from an enemy nation. Since two excelled with wind and earth, Van asked about their magic. The blonde girl said she could craft mud walls, while the other could one-shot wolves in orcs. The blonde, from a merchant family, confirmed she'd handled accounting and sales since childhood, running a store. They wanted to hire her if Van approved, and he wondered if her beauty swayed them. Belle suggested that if they opened an armory store at the entrance of Adventurer Town Espa, it'd sell well, and they could hand it over to the blonde girl. Next, they met Veda, a former noble child. Van asked if she'd prefer working at the inn, with the knights, or in the Lord's lobby, adding that as a cleaner, she'd learned from a sweet maid named Till. Veda chose cleaning, and Van found her adorable. She reminded him of Harem, a maid from his old home. He considered making her his secretary, but decided Till was enough. Suddenly, Veda sensed something off. They'd slabbed away with little food, so this kindness felt strange. When Van offered to make them all knights for the town, she was floored. Slavs becoming knights was unheard of. Van explained the area was monster-ridden and dangerous, but he believed they could protect the villagers if they did their jobs well. Vida had never heard of Slavs rising to knighthood. Understanding now why the others were so thrilled, she wondered why this was happening. Van looked relieved once everyone's roles were set. The knights knelt, pledging to serve him, but he clarified he wasn't enslave them. He just wanted them to work for the village, settle in, and find a purpose to chase. He urged them to strive together. Tears welled in Vida's eyes as she said they were Slavs, yet he spoke like they could live normally. Van replied that as the village lord, they were all his people, meant to look out for each other. Vida finally found her life's meaning. Whatever the task, as long as she could return here, she'd give her all. Van announced that inn builders and magic users should report to Asada, while ex-knights, mercenaries, and adventurers would join D. With the population boom, Seat Village buzzed. For bards, dancers, and musicians, they'd build a pub to hire them later. He asked agriculture-savvy folks to tend the fields and kids under 10 to help with laundry and get schooled. The Belgian Association taught newbies business, splitting carriages into 3 teams to grow their reach. Bell to the royal capital, Rango staying put. For the roughly 50 newcomers, Van planned to train them as Seat's first Holy Knight squad, teaching them to wield a powerful automatic crossbow as archers. Veda, a former hunter named Bora, noted she used a bow, but many others hadn't, questioning her selection. Van explained he picked first for experience, then sharp eyes, and finally small builds unsuited for swords and armor. Bora warned that bows weren't simple. Some frail kids might struggle without arm strength. Intrigued by her insight, Van agreed and chose the weakest-looking 11-year-old bull to test a light bow he'd made. He handed it to Bull, telling her to relax her shoulders and aim at the forest. Her first shot impressed him. Turning to the group, he asked if they'd all like to try the new bow. Bora, buzzing with excitement, went first and was blown away by its quality, claiming it could take down a large-class monster. Van mentioned they had ballista, so the bow wasn't necessary, but Bora's eyes lit up, eager to see a ballista. Van worried she might be trouble. He planned to appoint an experienced captain, but now doubted Bora's fit. For safety, he handed the team to Kamen, confident he'd manage. With that settled, he dove into crossbow research alongside them. As he worked, Van chatted away, mulling over ways to simplify it for users. Alti watched him mutter to himself and remarked he seemed to be enjoying it. Van agreed, mechanics and politics were tough, but this was a blast. He marveled at whoever invented crossbows, though his got stuck, suspecting it needed something elastic. The stick wouldn't budge, so he checked if metal parts would help. Alti, surprised, mumbled to herself about Van making mistakes, but he overheard, and she flushed, apologizing. Van laughed it off, admitting he messed up plenty. Magic was his only pride. Alti disagreed, praising his swordsmanship and studies as great talents, while she felt she had none, confessing jealousy. Van offered to connect her with a demonic executive and captain for training to match him. which made her giggle for some reason. Curious, he asked what magic she wielded. Casual question, but she trembled nervously. Till noticed too, assuring her Van wouldn't push and she could skip it if it was tough. Alti insisted on answering, revealing she had puppetry magic. This was a feared power, alongside Kin's thievery and brainwashing magic, labeled for cowardly sinners after a past incident. People assumed assassins were puppets, suspecting puppetry mages even with detection magic present. Compared to his useless magic, Van understood her hesitation. He asked what she could do with it, eager to see if she was okay sharing. Hiding it forever would be rough. Alti panicked, calling it dangerous, but Van wanted to support her, hoping she'd take pride in it. She pulled out a doll she kept hidden, unsure about showing him. With her power, the doll stood, and Van asked if it could move. She said yes, and it began dancing. Van was floored by its precise, human-like steps, no wasted motion. When it finished, he praised her incredible potential. Till agreed, awestruck by the magic, and asked if Alti danced too. Alti admitted she could, but excelled at puppeteering, shocking Van, as it meant she controlled the doll better than her own body, a mind-blowing skill to direct movements so perfectly. It was clear Alti's magic could be twisted for harm, but her demeanor suggested no one had shown her its positive potential. Till had a brilliant idea, making cute dolls for Alti to animate during festivals, delighting the villagers. Alti said she could move dolls her size, though she'd never tried bigger ones. They were eager to test it, so Van crafted a unique doll for her. Till, curious, asked why it held a sword and shield while wearing a dress. Van grinned, explaining that though it had danced well in a dress, he added weapons for emergencies. Made of mithril, the doll and its gear were light enough for it to handle, unlike typical wooden or leather shields. He chuckled, noting he'd need more mithril for future dolls. When he finished, Alti giggled for the first time, startling them. Van wondered if the shield caused it and offered to remove it. But that wasn't it. Till suggested swapping it for an umbrella, and Alti nodded. Till quickly backtracked, saying she didn't have to agree. Van and Alti locked eyes and burst out laughing, her first heartfelt laugh. After the warm moment, they tested the doll. Alti's control was stunning. Every move, big or small, was flawless. As Van turned to praise her, he saw her gasping, clutching her chest, and staggering. He caught her, asking if she was okay. She wheezed that she'd overused her mana, needing more than usual for the mithril doll, causing a mana shortage. They laid her down with water. Van, unfamiliar with mana limits, hadn't anticipated this. He suspected the mithril was the culprit and vowed to reduce its mana demand. Though weak, Alti felt uplifted, thanks to Van and Till. She'd always felt worthless, but now she'd seek her purpose. Van and Till smiled, relieved. He asked if she'd research her magic with him, believing they'd unlock its potential. Alti's joyful expression said it all. No smile needed. Later, they switched to wooden block dolls and showed them to the villagers. Van asked if she was ready to move them. She said yes, noting they felt like paper compared to mithril. Wooden dolls barely taxed her, and Van mused that metal might hinder mana flow. He saw how her magic's impact hinged on the caster. Alti, at 10, was grasping this. Was she starting to accept herself? As she awaited his cue, Van announced the Dance of Seat Village's mascot doll by Miss Alti. The villagers gaped as it moved lifelike. Some recognized puppetry magic, tied to assassinations, but Van urged them not to judge yet. The doll's dance was unlike anything they'd seen, and as Van praised Alti, her confidence soared, guiding the dolls like a master. After marveling at the wooden doll's graceful moves, the villagers fell silent. When the dance ended, Alti faced their stunned faces and earned a thunderous applause. They raved about the stunning moves, calling it the most beautiful dance they'd ever seen, and kids begged for an encore. Their eagerness for her magic made her realize Van's brilliance. She'd once feared her power as dark and wicked, but now, basking in praise, tears welled up. She ran to Van, sobbing as she hugged him. His words had sparked hope that she could love her magic and herself. Van hugged her back, suggesting she perform at dinner too, promising they'd all be joyful from now on. He set a personal goal to make Alti laugh more, vowing to build her a stage and asking her favorite dresses so the dolls could wear them, just to see her smile. With that, they wrapped the night on a joyful high. Meanwhile, a man appeared, buzzing with excitement over Van. Exhausted from overwork, Van sat for tea with Alti, who asked if he'd ever collapsed from mana overuse. He hadn't, and Alti wondered if her own mana was lacking. Till leaned in, saying not to compare herself to Van. Mana wasn't visible. Those with elemental affinity needed tests, like counting mid or high-level spells, or how long they could sustain low-level ones. Some wielded all 4 elements but only managed low-level spells, while mastering high-level ones like Panamera or Asada was rare. Van cast high-level equivalent spells for hours, a feat Alti found unheard of. He brushed it off, saying Asada matched him, arrested after one big spell. Though his mana pool's size was unclear, his feats in the village screamed exceptional. Even the world's top mage would collapse in 2 hours doing what he did. Since everyone kept saying it, Van figured they'd be shocked. Asada calmly noted they already were every time. A month earlier in the capital, the king tasked First Prince Chilio with running the country for 3 months. Chilio asked if it was about the new Baron boy, offering to send someone to confirm. He puzzled over why Prime Minister Apila Tadu was joining. Apella quipped he couldn't let the king enjoy a rare trip solo. If he couldn't lead the capital, neither could his majesty. The king insisted it wasn't about him. He usually summoned people, but this small village lord likely couldn't travel, so he'd go himself. Chilio suggested leading scouts be, noting neighboring countries were restless, poised to strike any time. They were likely sizing up border lords. Those with power, nobles, strong squads, or mages were key. A village of 100 slaying a dragon meant a lord worth meeting personally. Chilio, sharp like his father, was handsome and well-liked, poised to be a great lord if guided right. But he craved peace too much, never considering conflict with rivals. Peace was ideal, yet with nations bulking up and eyeing opportunities, hesitation could doom them. Strength, the king knew, was their land's shield. The king realized Pista was the same age as this new lord. Pista loved swords and horses, but cared little for politics, so this lord might spark something in him. He thought it'd be a valuable lesson and brought him along. Turning to Chilio, the king recalled working tirelessly as king at his age. These 3 months would be a wake-up call. He urged Chilio to do his best as acting king, and with that, they departed the capital. It'd been ages since the king's last long trip, stirring memories of his youth when he could roam freely without royal prep. Disguising the trailing vessels was impossible, so they couldn't blend in to watch commoners' lives unfold naturally. Everyone knelt at the sight of the royal crest, faces to the ground. Some stood briefly but were quickly forced down. It made sense, yet bored the king. He didn't want to rule through fear. Losing respect could weaken royal authority, but it'd also flush out schemers. Balancing law and order, punishing crime, was key, yet he found it dull. He still couldn't fathom how a village slew a dragon. Pista called him to look. Seat Village's massive wall stunned them. Apella noted it should have been just shacks, marveling at the breakneck building pace. The king asked what he meant, and Apella's blunt intrigue amused him. He agreed, eager to see the fort and uncover its secrets. Inside the village, things were livelier than the fort. Alti's dancing dolls drew applause, kids played with them, and she beamed. Her magic was a hit. Though she needed a little help, she was thrilled. She practiced daily, refining her delicate control, and Van was glad the villagers embraced it over fearing it. Then word came of an ornate carriage arriving. From the fort, its grandeur stood out. Ortho guessed it was an official verifying the dragon's subjugation. Piriel and Kusara thought it might be promotion papers or dungeon business. The villagers buzzed with curiosity, some hoping for another barbecue now that Van was a baron. Van overheard and said it'd be a nighttime event, sparking excitement as they prepped the grill. Too early, but he let it slide, musing they'd survive on veggies and fruit otherwise. Espat confirmed the royal crest on the carriage, suggesting they muster everyone. Mechanical crossbow team, Seat Village's knights, and Espada's knights, over 100 strong. Their gear blended wood blocks and iron for versatility, with iron shields, mithril swords, and long spears ready for anything. Van grinned with confidence and excitement to greet the official, eager to offer his time. As Van, now a baron, graciously opened the gate, he was floored by the first figure he saw, Panamera. Her striking presence hit him hard, though she teased that his reaction was tame, asking if he'd found another woman. Van stammered he was just shocked and mentioned growing close to Alti. Alti bounded over, warmly greeting Panamera and peppering her with questions about her travels. Panamera, struck by the brightness in Alti's face and eyes, demanded to know what Van had done, joking if he'd used brainwashing magic. Van explained Alti had lacked faith in her magic, so he'd shown her its wonder. Panamera grew serious, hearing Alti speak of her magic for the first time. She pinched Alti's cheeks, calling it awesome, then laughed, dubbing Van the Charmer. Saving the fun for later, she told him to bow as a baron should before his majesty. Van froze, nerves spiking as King Danu approached. He couldn't believe the king was here, so far from the royal capital, but it was real. King Dano of Shora introduced himself, welcoming Van to noble society and urging him to demonstrate how his knowledge and power could enrich the land. He anticipated great things for the kingdom's growth. Kneeling, Van silently questioned why the king had come. Could he even lead the capital? King Dino mentioned hearing of Van's dungeon discovery, noting the guild's investment squad would arrive soon, and Van should brief them fully. Their report would reach him, so no lies. He praised Van's forest dragon subjugation and auctions, saying a knight should have come instead, but the odd reports demanded his personal visit. He questioned Van thoroughly and asked if he objected. Van raised his head, vowing to answer honestly, but requested a promise from the king. Surprised by both the objection and Van's mature response, the king listened. Van said he'd share everything, but it might sound unbelievable, so he asked the king to promise to try believing him. Apella snickered as the king, taken aback, expressed his astonishment. He then agreed to make the effort to believe Van's tale.